Welcome back to World Religions. Today we're going to look at a historical survey of Korean and Japanese religions. We're going to start with the Gojoseon period of Korean history. Gojoseon was the oldest known Korean kingdom. According to Korean tradition, it was founded in the year 2333 BC by Tangun, about whom more later. Historically speaking, it was first mentioned in a Chinese text from the 7th century BC, so it probably dates back at least that far, although modern scholars regard the traditional founding as legendary, that date. In the year 194 BC, a man from China named Wei Mon took over the kingdom. He was essentially a political exile from China who was able to gather an army together and take over Gojoseon. Within less than 100 years thereafter, in 108 BC, the kingdom was then conquered by the Han dynasty, also of China. Many of the legends of Gojoseon were recorded in a much later text called Memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms by Goryeo, who is a Korean scholar, basically, who lived in the 13th century AD, and some other later works as well. But the stories are probably quite ancient. They've been around centuries before the authorship of the Memorabilia of the Three Kingdoms, although many of them are, probably legendary. So, what are some of the stories of this period? The people that are talked about include gods and legendary figures, and these are some of the gods worshipped in Singyo, the traditional Korean form of animism. So the main god is Hanamin, also known as Hwanin. His name means heaven in Korean. He's regarded as the king or the emperor of heaven. He brings sunlight and rain. He also will send lightning, drought, and disasters as judgment upon the wicked. The traditional belief is that humans live and breathe because of Hanamin. Later, he was compared to Indra, the king of the Devas or gods in Hinduism and Buddhism. This comparison was essentially brought over with the Buddhist religion. Even though Buddhists don't mainly worship the gods or devas, it's a kind of part of the lore of Buddhism that these beings are there in the world. The kings of Korea would confess their sins and appeal to Hanamin if there were a natural disaster. So the king was kind of like the main worshiper, in a sense, of Hanamin, with the idea that there's a parallel between being the king or sovereign on earth and the sovereignty of Hanamin in heaven. So, according to tradition, Hanamin was the father of Hwanung and the grandfather of Tangun. Tangun was the founder of Korea. Hwanung, or Ung, his name means supreme divine regent. He was the son of Hananim, and the father of Tangun. So he came from heaven, but he wanted to descend to the earth to live among the mountains and valleys. So he descended with 3,000 of his heavenly followers, who were various spirits of cloud and rain, to a sandalwood tree on Baekdu Mountain. So that was a holy place for Hwanung. There's a story of his meeting with a tiger and a bear. They worshipped him and wanted to become human. So Hwanung told them to only eat herbs, namely garlic and mugwort, for 100 days. The idea of the animal spirits and of fasting while eating these sacred herbs, those are reflected in Korean animism and shamanism. So a lot of these stories are kind of part and parcel of that aspect of traditional Korean religion. The tiger gave up after only 20 days, but the bear kept fasting. So eventually the bear was turned into a human woman named Eun-Yeo. And Hwanung later married Eun-Yeo, and they together sired Tangun. Tangun's name means mountain god, and he's the son of Hwanung and Ungnyeong. So according to tradition, he founded the kingdom of Gojoseon, or Old Joseon, in 2333 BC. This event is celebrated by the National Foundation Day, or Opening of Heaven Day, literally, Gaecheonjeol, which is celebrated in South Korea on October 3rd. And this also shows you how these stories are integrated into Korean culture, even among Koreans who are not animists or followers of Korean shamanism. So I mentioned Singyo before. This is Korean animism, or worshiping many gods and spirits of nature. It's the indigenous religion from Korea. It's also called Sindo. Sinkyo basically means the religion or sect of the spirits. Sindo is the way of the spirits, and it's cognate with Japanese Shinto. As far as I know, both of these terms are coming actually from Chinese Shundao, the way of the spirits, but it's just the Korean way of pronouncing that Chinese term. Uh, Later in Korean history, towards the end of the Gojoseon period, they got a lot of influence from Chinese culture. So Chinese, for example, was the language of a lot of the Buddhist scriptures, even when they were studied in Korea. The earlier form of the Korean writing system was based on Chinese, etc. So, Singyo, you can see elements of it in some of those Korean myths and legends about the founding of the nation. There's those animal spirits, the bear and the tiger. There's also belief in many different gods and spirits of nature, like the river Earl, who's a god of rivers, and various dragons who are often spirits of rivers or seas. The stories of the marriage between gods and humans, and ascending into heaven or descending from heaven. So some of the types of gods and spirits that are part of Sinkyo, including gods and goddesses of the mountains, the dragon kings, who are the gods of the seas. There's a male spirit general who governs above the earth, and a female spirit general who governs below the earth. And there's also various gods or spirits of the household, including of the hearth, the roof beam, and even the outhouse. Another element of Sinkyo is ancestor worship. This is probably at least as old as Korean culture itself. Around 2,000 years ago, according to modern archaeology, Koreans buried their dead with their personal belongings, including gold and silver. That's just one example of respecting the ancestors, but there's also a bunch of other rituals done too by the living. And later on, this got incorporated with Confucianism that was brought over from China. There's also the term Mugyo, which means shamanism. It comes from the word mu or mudong, which is a shaman. So another word for Mugyo is musok. It's also called muism in English. It basically overlaps with Sinkyo or animism. So Mudong is a female shaman, Paksuk is a male shaman. The Mudong are actually more common than the Paksuk. And these shamans perform gut or ceremonies, such as for exorcising harmful spirits, celebrating or blessing a community, rituals of thanksgiving, etc. The picture on the slide is just of a mudong in the midst of a ceremony. You can see stacked up fruit and flower offerings to the spirits in the back. So some examples of these gut or ceremonies or rituals. You can see the picture on the slide, a mudong doing a sort of dance in ceremonial garb with images of some of the gods in the back and some offerings left for them. So one of the rituals is the spring plowing ceremony, where farmers will use music and ritual to pacify the spirits of the earth, which helps ensure a good harvest later in the year. There's also the ridgepole ceremony, when traditionally that would be performed when a new house was being built. Specifically, when the ridgepole was being raised, Wine and food would be thrown at it, and a member of the household would chant, "Please, grandfather and grandmother of the ridgepole, bless us with good luck and long life and many sons." Burial rituals are based on the belief that the spirits of the earth must be satisfied before a body can be buried. In traditional Korean culture, death is also regarded as impure and is potentially disturbing the cosmic balance, which is another reason why shamans may have to perform ceremonies uh, accompanying the burial. This is more of a custom, but there's a custom in Korean culture of throwing a stone on an altar to prevent sore feet before taking a long journey. Another custom would be spitting on an altar, which, ironically, from the Western perspective, is a sign of purification and warding off of evil spirits. So some other examples, in addition to the spring plowing ceremony to help assure a good harvest, there can be ceremonies to assure that fishermen have safe journeys and a good catch that would be performed by a shaman. Ceremonies to cure disease, to produce sons for barren women, to recall spirits of the dead after funerals and help lead them to the kingdom of the blessed, and pacifying the spirits of those who died violent or tragic deaths, which otherwise might come back to haunt or curse their family. Now we're going to look at the next main period of Korean history, that of the Three Kingdoms period, and talk about how Korean religion evolved during that era. The Three Kingdoms period lasted from around 18 BC to 660 AD. So the three kingdoms were Goryeo, Baekje, and Silla. You can see on the picture on the map, which is showing the borders in the year 476 AD, that there's also a region known as Gaya. This was a confederacy of smaller city-states, although it was eventually conquered by Silla. So Goryeo was founded by King Dongmyeong, who lived from 58 to 19 BC. And according to the traditional story, Dongmyeong was formed from an egg after the sun shone on the breast of the eldest daughter of the river earl. That was the river god mentioned previously. And then Dongmyeong rose to heaven at the end of his rule. So you can see the earliest histories of Korea, they kind of fade off into legend. Again, according to a traditional account, the kingdom of Baekje was founded by King Onjo, who was the son of Dongmyeong. And the kingdom of Silla was founded by King Hyeokgyose, who was born from a red egg, and he emitted light. And then his wife was brought by a dragon near a well. So lots of tales of wonder. The overall style, and you could say the genre of some of these stories, resembles the ancient Chinese text, Chu Tzi, or Songs of the State of Chu, sometimes called Songs of the South, which also has tales of wonder kind of involving historical figures and other people. This was the period, the Three Kingdoms period, when Chinese religions came to Korea and really started influencing the culture. So as mentioned before, Confucianism, which has its own traditions of ancestor worship, influenced Korean ancestor worship and Korean culture generally. Taoism influenced Korean magic, geomancy, and the practice of Mugyo or shamanism. And Buddhism became associated in Korean culture with healing and with divination practices, although they had similar types of Buddhism as in China. But those were some of the specific associations with Buddhism as opposed to like Taoism and Confucianism, for example. Although I would add to that briefly that Taoism is also associated with feng shui, or called geomancy in Korean, and other divination techniques. So a bit more about Korean Confucianism. Confucianism came to Korea in the 3rd century AD and after. So the Confucian tradition regards xiao, as the Chinese would say, or filial piety, as the highest virtue. So people need to respect their parents. Xiao literally means being a good son. But this can be expanded to respecting other family members that are older and just elders, ancestors, and respecting anyone that has a rank or hierarchy over a person. And it's regarded in the Confucian tradition as the basis for individual virtue and for social order and harmony. And those ideas came to Korea as well in this time. As mentioned, Confucianism influenced the Korean ancestor worship. One of the examples of ancestor worship in Korean culture is offering food to kinsmen at the time of their death, and also at memorial times in the year, in the hope that the ancestor would grant their favor to their descendants. You can see the picture on the slide is a modern version of this, an altar set up for ancestor veneration at the time of a festival. And you can see there's meat offerings there as well as fruit offerings and rice cakes. So Taoism came from China to Korea at this time. An example of a Taoist influence on Korean animism is the figure of the Holy Mother. This is a Korean mountain goddess and the traditional guardian of the kingdom of Silla. So according to tradition, she was an immortal daughter of a Chinese emperor who settled in Korea and gave birth to the first ruler of Silla. And the beliefs about the Holy Mother were influenced by Taoist beliefs in immortality. You can see a picture of her on the slide, and you can also see that she has a tiger beside her. This is like the figure Shi Wang Mu, or the Queen Mother of the West, who's a part of Chinese religious Taoism and Chinese folk religion. The Tang dynasty of China saw Taoism supported by the emperor, so it became the state religion in a sense. During that period, the Chinese emperors sent copies of the Tao Te Ching, which was the main scripture of Taoism, and Taoist priests to Korea. So that was the main vector or way in which Taoist ideas came to Korea. Taoist texts were also studied by later generations of Korean Confucian scholars. Even though they were Confucians, they were the same class of literati or literate scholars who could read various types of Chinese texts. So the yin-yang cosmology, which is associated with Taoism from China, but you also see it in Confucianism, and just traditional Chinese culture generally. It really predates Confucianism and Taoism per se, having antecedents at least going back to the early Zhou dynasty, maybe as far back as around or close to 1000 BC. So the basic idea of yin and yang is of darkness and light. That was the origin of it. Yin was the north side of a hill or building that tended to get less sunlight throughout the day, at least in the northern hemisphere. And yang was the south or sun-facing side of a hill, mountain, or building, which tended to get more sunlight. And they eventually evolved in Chinese belief to cosmic elements that combined in various ever-flowing patterns in nature, society, and even an individual person. So yin is associated with the negative, passive, weak, and destructive, as well as the feminine, mother's softness, darkness, and being wet. And yang is associated with positive, active, strong, and constructive, as well as the male, father, hardness, and brightness. Although they're opposing forces, there's a kind of harmony in the form of a dynamic equilibrium that emerges out of their interactions, which is always changing. In Korean culture, they represent the Daiji, which is Chinese for great ultimate or supreme ultimate, which is kind of like a diagram or a symbol of the dynamic harmony of yin and yang. It's called Taegeuk, and it's usually depicted with a horizontal divide between the yang and the yin, and the yang side of it is usually depicted as red as opposed to white, and the yin side below as blue as opposed to black. That symbol is also used on the modern flag of the nation of South Korea. So around this time as well, the Three Kingdoms period, Chinese feng shui, or the traditions, the ancient form of feng shui, came to Korea. And in the Korean context, it's often labeled geomancy, which is from Greek words for earth divination. So it's kind of reading the earth wind and water and other forces and elements of nature to try to get insight not only on the changes of nature in general, but on how to site and orient things like houses and graves as well, based on the flow of chi or energy throughout the cosmos. So it's basically the Korean equivalent of the Chinese feng shui. In addition to the yin yang theory, there was also a Chinese theory of the five elements: wood, metal, fire, water, and earth, and their various interactions in a kind of cycle that also got incorporated into Korean cosmology or theory of the world and metaphysics during this time. So, Korean Buddhism was brought to Korea by monks from China and India in the 4th century AD. So, in the kingdom of Goryeo, Buddhism was introduced by a Chinese monk in the year 372 AD. And in the kingdom of Baekje, it was introduced by an Indian monk named Maranatha in 384 AD. In the kingdom of Silla, Buddhism was initially mainly supported by the people and by King Beopheong and his minister Ichadon, who was in power from the years 501 to 527 AD. But the other officials at the king's court initially resisted Buddhism. So there's a traditional story that Ichadon conspired so that he would be executed by his rivals at court, but he successfully predicted that a miracle would occur at his execution, which did indeed happen, and was a kind of public testament to the truth and power of Buddhism. So after that time, Buddhism then was accepted also by the officials at the court of the king of Silla, and then spread throughout their society as well. Later on, Buddhists even traveled from Korea to Japan. There was a delegation of scholars who went there in the year 577, for example. A very important figure in Korean Buddhism is Goryeo, who lived from 617 to 686. He was a monk from the kingdom of Silla. He traveled to China to try to find new teachers of Buddhism. This was a common practice both in Korean Buddhism and in Japanese Buddhism. If someone wanted to study the religion more deeply, they might just go to China because from their perspective, that was where Buddhism originally came from. I mean, they knew it originated in India, but it had been in China for much longer, and the Chinese forms of Buddhism were the ones introduced to Korea and Japan respectively. So that's why Goryeo decided to go to China to try to learn more about Buddhism. When he was there, he unknowingly slept one night in a tomb and drank brackish water from a human skull, and he only realized the next morning what he had done. This gave him an insight, though, into death, impermanence, mortality, and helped him obtain enlightenment. His own version of Buddhism is called Interpenetrated Buddhism, or Tong Bulgyo in Korean. So he ended up combining teachings of the Madhyamaka school of Mahayana Buddhism, which is called Samron in Korean, and the Yusik or Yogacara school of Mahayana Buddhism, with the practice of chanting mantras of the Jeongto, or Pure Land school of Mahayana Buddhism. In other words, there's these three schools or sects of Mahayana, or Great Vehicle Buddhism, that were in China at the time. Madhyamaka, which is based on the philosophy of emptiness. Yogacara, which is based on the idea that consciousness is the primary reality. And Pure Land, which is based on the idea that you can be saved, you can attain nirvana by praying to Amitabha Buddha and relying on the grace of the Buddha to be reborn in a pure land created by Amitabha, or Amidwo in Chinese. And these are different approaches to the Mahayana, or Great Vehicle school of Buddhism, and Goryeo combined or synthesized them together. Now we're going to talk about the Goryeo period of Korean history. So before we get to Goryeo, there were a couple of other periods. From 668 to 935, Korea was united under the kingdom of Silla. So Silla ended up conquering the other of the three kingdoms and ruled most of the peninsula for those centuries. There was also a period of disunion again called the Later Three Kingdoms period, where United Silla was split again into three kingdoms called Later Goguryeo, Later Baekje, and Silla. And then from 918 to 1392, Korea was again united under the kingdom of Goryeo. And this kingdom was founded by King Taejo of Goryeo. He was a Buddhist, but he also encouraged Confucian learning. King Taejo of Goryeo supported Confucianism by setting up a Confucian examination system modeled after that of the Tang Dynasty of China. The Chinese Confucian imperial exam system actually went back to the earlier Han Dynasty, and it was based on the principle that the officials who served in the imperial bureaucracy should not just be people who had family or other personal connections to the emperor, but people who were qualified to help govern because of their knowledge of the Confucian classics. And that's what they were tested on in the examination system to qualify for a government job. So this modified the structure of the government of Goryeo, which previously just the aristocratic, the noble families kind of just inherited their position and their rank, and they were generally assigned various tasks by the king of Goryeo and other earlier Korean kingdoms. But with the examination system, the sons of aristocratic families or others had to prove their knowledge of the Confucian classics by taking the exam in order to qualify for a government position. King Taejo of Goryeo is also known for his so-called 10 injunctions, some of which relate to Korean religion. The first injunction related to Buddhism because it called for building temples for both the Seon and Gyo schools of Korean Buddhism, about which more later. The third injunction related to Confucianism because it expressed the principle that only a morally worthy heir should become king. That was the Confucian principle of meritocracy, that at least ideally it was not just a matter of birth that determined who ruled a nation, but merit as well, moral worth. And then the fourth injunction acknowledged the influence on Korea of the Tang dynasty from China, but also sought to honor native Korean traditions, which would overlap with the religious traditions of Singyo and Mugyo discussed previously. Later in the Goryeo period, a Confucian academy or school for the study of Confucian classics was established by the scholar Cho Chong, who lived from 948 to 1068. The picture on the slide is from a modern Confucian primary school in South Korea. Confucianism is still a living tradition in Korea. It affects the overall culture, and some people are more dedicated to others. You know, they might send their children to a Confucian school, or they might study the Confucian classics and practice Korean versions of Confucian ceremonies, etc. Buddhism in Korea during the Goryeo period divided into two main schools: the Seon or meditation school and the Gyo or study schools. So Seon is the Korean way of saying the Chinese word Chan, which is called Zen in Japanese. Chan is actually the Chinese word for dhyana in Sanskrit, or concentration. So this was a school focusing on meditation and meditation practice as being the cornerstone of Buddhism. Korean Seon was based in temples or monasteries that were in the 9 sacred mountains of Korea. The Gyo or study schools would focus on studying a particular sutra, generally one from Mahayana Buddhism. During the Goryeo period, there was also an innovation in Korean Buddhism created by the Buddhist monks U Cheon, who lived from 1055 to 1101, and Jin Ul, who lived from 1158 to 1210. They both helped create a syncretist or synthetic version of the Seon and Gyo schools. They try to combine the two approaches together. Jin-ul in particular taught that sudden enlightenment, which was a main theme of Seon or Chan Buddhism, was followed by gradual practice. There was a long-standing debate in Chan Buddhist circles about whether enlightenment was sudden or gradual. And this was Jin-ul's particular solution to that problem, that yes, enlightenment would begin with a kind of sudden, spontaneous aha moment or insight, but then you would have to follow it up with steady long-term meditation practice in order to develop it or make it stick, basically. So Jin-ul also founded the Jogye order, which became the main school of traditional Buddhism in Korea. And it's classified technically as a type of Seon, even though it includes ideas from the Gyo schools as well. The picture on the slide is of Jogye Temple in Seoul, South Korea, which is the main temple of the Jogye order of Korean Buddhism. Also, during the Goryeo Kingdom, there was a printing of the Buddhist scriptures. The Korean version of the Buddhist scriptures is called the Tripitaka Koreana. Tripitaka is the Pali word for triple basket. This is the original Indian term for the Buddhist scriptures, which was divided into three main baskets or collections. And the word Koreana is just indicating here, actually using a Latin version of the word Korea, that this is the Korean version of that canon. The Tripitaka originated in ancient Buddhism, but that structure also was maintained by later Mahayana Buddhism, which developed several centuries after the time of the Buddha. So the Tripitaka Koreana was printed on woodblock. So they had woodblock printing technology in Korea at this time. It was still a very expensive undertaking. And the printed books were kept at Heian Temple on Mount Gaya, one of the sacred mountains in Korea. Like in China and a lot of other cultures, a lot of the Buddhist temples and other temples like the Singyo religion were on sacred mountains in Korea. So the total number of woodblocks is astonishing. There were 80,000 of them in order to contain all of the sutras and other texts of the Buddhist canonical scriptures. They were written in Chinese as well. So before the development of the modern system of writing Hangul that's used in Korea, I mean modern relatively, but they used to use Chinese writing that was just the Chinese characters that could be read in Korean, but the actual symbols for the words were originally from China. A similar system was used in Japan until they developed their own kind of syllabic alphabet. And this in particular was done and is still done for the Buddhist scriptures, which came to Korea in their Chinese versions. So 80,000 wood blocks, all of which had to be carved by hand before they were printed, a very enormous undertaking. So this was done as an act of merit to try to gain the Buddha's protection. And specifically in Korea at that time, the 13th century AD, they were worried about the Mongols who were invading and conquering all over East Asia at the time. Another interesting Korean Buddhist text from the Goryeo period is called Ji-ki, which means straight pointing. It was authored in 1377. This is significant because it was the first book to be printed with movable metal type. And it's actually an anthology of Seon or Korean Chan Buddhist texts. It was printed at the Haeongdae Temple in Cheongju. The picture on the slide is of all of those printed books containing the Tripitaka Koreana. And you can see it's not even just one book or even a shelf of books. It's a whole hallway of shelves of books. Now we're going to look at the Joseon period. The Joseon period lasted from 1392 to 1897. It's named after the kingdom of Joseon, which ruled all of the Korean peninsula during this period. So the founder of the Joseon dynasty was King Taejo of Joseon, not to be confused with King Taejo of Goryeo. He promoted Neo-Confucianism but opposed Buddhism. The Imjin War happened during the Joseon period. This was from 1592 to 1598. This was the war when Japan invaded under the Japanese military leader Toyotomi Hideyoshi, but they were eventually forced out of the Korean peninsula after they had initially secured some victories on the battlefield, but they were unable to maintain control of Korea. Later in the Joseon period, there was an invasion by the Manchus, a nomadic people similar in terms of their way of life to the Mongols or other Central Asian nomadic peoples. They also invaded China around this time and conquered it. The Korea became a tributary state of the Qing dynasty, which was the dynasty the Manchus had previously set up in China. So a bit more about Buddhism during this period. As mentioned, King Taejo of Joseon was suppressing Buddhism and promoting Confucianism in its stead. He banned the building of Buddhist monasteries, for example. His son, Taejong of Joseon, who ruled from 1367 to 1422, disestablished Buddhist temples, confiscated the estates, workers, and slaves that were owned by the more prosperous Buddhist temples. He also defaced Buddhist sculptures. Buddhism was, in other words, widely suppressed during the rule of King Taejong and was largely confined to the mountains and other areas outside the cities. Buddhist funerals and memorials, which were a big part of Korean culture, were replaced with Confucian rituals. And there was the custom established that the eldest son should perform the ancestor rituals and inherit the family property. So, kind of enforcing Confucian ideas of family hierarchy. Later, however, in the Joseon period, the persecution of Buddhism lessened. During the reign of Queen Moonjeong, who lived from 1502 to 1565, she served as the regent for her younger son, Myeongjong, and she was a devout Buddhist. She repealed many of the anti-Buddhist laws. Later as well, during the 16th century, during the Imjin War, Buddhists regained some respect from the government and the broader culture by assisting greatly in the fight against the Japanese. One of the main philosophical or religious traditions that was prominent during the Joseon period was that of so-called Neo-Confucianism. That's the Western term for the Confucianism that developed initially in China during the Song and Ming dynasties. So it's known in Chinese as Song Ming Rujia, or the Confucianism Rujia of the Song and Ming dynasties. So this way of thinking, which was largely based initially on the Chinese scholar Chu Shi, his interpretation of Confucianism, but it was first exemplified in Korea by the scholar Zhou Guangzhou, who lived from 1482 to 1519. So he was a Confucian, but he was also anti-Buddhist and other non-Confucian beliefs and practices. He encouraged the government to rule by moral authority, not just brute force. So he created a construct called the Family Compact, which was a system for village government that he had based on a similar concept by the Chinese Neo-Confucian Chu Shi, who wrote a text called the Lu Family Compact. So he had a big impact on Korean Confucianism, but his life was cut short by political intrigue. He was sentenced to death by poisoning by some of his political enemies. Because the Confucian scholars were often involved in the government, there were often political intrigues and power plays, And sometimes this ended up affecting some of the Confucian scholars, including important ones like Zhou Guangzhou. One of the main themes of Korean Neo-Confucianism was the so-called 4-7 debate. This was basically a debate about human nature and how it intersected with some concepts from Neo-Confucian philosophy. So the 4-7 debate happened mainly during the 16th century. One of the main figures involved was Yi Huang, a Korean Confucian scholar who lived from 1501 to 1570. He also established a Confucian academy in Korea. And the debate was based on some concepts from the Chinese Neo-Confucian Chu Shi, who proposed a kind of dualistic account of human nature, in which humans are born with two main different features or properties in their heart or their mind. One was Li in Chinese, which means principle, and the other was Qi, which can be translated as energy or vital energy or even material force. According to Chu Shi's account, Li, or principle, comes from heaven, which in Confucian philosophy is the source of morality and order. And this Li, this principle, is always good. So we're kind of born knowing the pattern or the form of what is good, what is right, and what is wrong. We have that innately, according to Chu Shi's version of Neo-Confucianism. However, we're also born with our own particular allotment of qi, or vital energy, and this can include various emotional and quasi-physical or physiological tendencies or traits, like being prone to anger or fear or greed or whatever. The chi is not always bad, it can be good or bad, but it really has to be regulated by Li in order for a person to obtain virtue. So, according to the Korean way of naming these properties, they would call Li, or principle, E, and Chi, or energy, they call Ki in Korean. So, according to Chu Shi's scheme, heaven gives all humans the same E, or heavenly principle, but individual humans are going to have different combinations of Ki, and that's related to different temperament and different characteristic moral flaws from different people. So why was this called, this debate over human nature, called the 4-7 debate? Well, it related to another element of Chu Shi's philosophy. The principles or elements in the human mind associated with heavenly principle, or E, were called the four heart minds. And this is related to an older Confucian concept that goes back to Mengzi, at least, an earlier Confucian scholar, that we're born with the seeds of the four main virtues in us. And according to Chu Shi, these seeds or elements of virtue, they are based on heavenly principle called Li, or E. But we're also born with 7 emotions, and these are the ones associated with Ki, and they can be bad when they're out of balance. So the 4-7 debate is essentially about the relative strength or priority or significance of the 4 heart minds, or seeds of virtue, and the 7 emotions. So 2 of the main scholars in the debate were Yi Huang and Yi Yi. Yi Huang is known for the saying, "E rises, Qi follows." So he thought that human nature was a mix of the 2 main principles, E and Qi, but he thought that E had a natural role of leading or governing the Qi, so it had a kind of priority. Yi Yi, though, is even more optimistic about human nature. So he thought that E was so strong that it pervades everything uniformly. Human nature, in its original essence, you might say, or inner being, is perfectly good, or E. So this is kind of a debate, a kind of inside baseball debate among these different Neo-Confucians, who share a basically optimistic view about human nature, but it just depends on how much priority they assign to the E, or heavenly principle. And this general trend of Neo-Confucianism, both in China and Korea, of having a kind of more optimistic view of human nature, I think it's fair to say, was probably influenced by ideas from Taoism and Buddhism. This is somewhat ironic because Chu Shi's Neo-Confucianism developed originally as a reaction against the influence of Taoism and Buddhism in China. But Chinese Buddhism often included the idea of Buddha nature, or that we have in our nature as conscious beings enlightenment or Buddhahood already there. We just have to unveil it or get rid of these adventitious defilements. See our original nature, which is enlightened. Similarly, in Taoism, there is this doctrine of the uncarved block, that the natural way of things, which can be symbolized by a tree that hasn't been chopped down or a block of stone that hasn't been worked by humans and cut or mutilated or what have you, it has this wholeness, this intrinsic integrity that you just need to allow to be and not try to overly work it, and then you can be virtuous by analogy as a human as well. And so, arguably, those more optimistic or idealistic views of human nature from Taoism and Buddhism ended up influencing the Neo Confucian accounts as well. Christianity also came to Korea during the period of Joseon. So the first type to arrive was Catholic Christianity. There were earlier missions from Jesuits living in China, but one of the important figures for establishing Catholic Christianity in Korea was Yi Seong-hun, who lived from 1756 to 1801. And he helped bring Catholicism to Korea in the late 1700s. Catholics were persecuted by the kingdom of Joseon because, at least in Korea, they mostly opposed ancestor worship. The Catholic Jesuits in China, at least for a time, they were actually arguing that the Catholic Church in China should permit Confucian ancestor worship to continue, that it was just a kind of cultural ceremony and not inherently religious. That view didn't end up taking hold, though, among the Korean Catholics who were opposed to ancestor worship. They thought of it as fundamentally incompatible with their Catholicism. And so they ended up being persecuted by the kingdom of Joseon because the Joseon kings regarded ancestor worship as just a really important part of Korean culture. The first Korean-born Catholic priest was Andrew Kim Tae-gun, who lived from 1821 to 1846. He died young because he was martyred by the kingdom of Joseon because of his faith, and he became the patron saint of Korean priests. Protestant Christianity was introduced to Korea later by missionaries in the late 1800s. An important figure in this process was John Ross. He was a Scottish Presbyterian minister. He actually lived in China, but he translated the New Testament into the Korean language in 1887, and it was taken to Korea by other Presbyterian and Protestant pastors. One of the most significant events that helped spread Protestant Christianity in Korea was the establishment of primary schools by Protestant missionaries. The first two were the Pai Chai School, which was established by Methodists for boys, school for boys in 1885, and the Methodist Church also established the Ewa School for girls in 1886. Now we're going to talk about Korean religions in the modern period, the last 120 years or so. So Korea in the 20th century saw a lot of traumatic political developments. The Japanese occupied the Korean peninsula, ruled it as a colony from 1910 to 1945. And during this period, there were a lot of laws that were repressive of Koreans. There's still a lot of animosity of Koreans for Japanese because of this period of colonization. Japan, later in the 19th century, had undergone the Meiji Restoration, which overthrew their traditional feudal military government, and they rapidly modernized in the late 1800s, including getting Western science, technology, and industry, and developing a modern army and navy. And that's why they were able to overpower and conquer Korea. After the end of World War II in 1945, Korea was divided into North and South Korea. The northern part was occupied by the Soviet Union and the southern part by the United States of America. And they created separate governments in the North and South. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The United Nations sent an army, which was mainly composed of troops from the United States, but also other allied nations, to defend South Korea from this attack. Eventually, China also entered the war on the side of North Korea, the People's Republic of China, which, like North Korea, was also communist by this time. They ended up eventually getting to a stalemate where North Korea remained communist, South Korea remained non-communist, and in between them was a DMZ or demilitarized zone. They never ended the war with a formal treaty, and you've probably heard of the military tensions and political tensions that still remain between North Korea and South Korea. North Korea is communist and atheist, so for the most part, they've gotten rid of most religion, with a few exceptions. Traditional Korean religion and other religions like Christianity are much stronger in South Korea. So, what about Mugyo or shamanism today in Korea? During the later Joseon period in the late 1800s, Mugyo was attacked as devil worship by many Protestant missionaries and was also criticized as outdated superstition by Korean reformers who were trying to modernize Korea. More recently, in the 20th century, there was something called the New Community Movement, which was a rural modernization movement initiated by the former president of Korea, Park Chung-hee. Part of this movement, though, was attacking Mugyo or shamanism because of its perceived regressive or outdated aspects. More recently, though, since the 1980s and 90s, there's been a bit of a revival of Mugyo and an increased sense of appreciation, at least among some South Koreans, of Mugyo because it's associated with their national identity and culture. Nevertheless, it's much less prevalent as a tradition than it was before its persecutions in the 19th and 20th centuries. The picture on the slide is of the Samseonggung Shrine, which is dedicated to Hwanin, Hwanung, and Tangun, three most important gods in Singyo. That's located on Jiri Mountain in South Korea. During the late 18 and early 1900s, there were a lot of critiques of Confucianism in Korea by Korean reformers, such as Yoon Chi-ho, shown on the slide. In the picture, he lived from 1864 to 1945. Yoon Chi-ho favored complete westernization for Korea and an end of Korea's relationship with China. Throughout most of its history, China was the most developed civilization in East Asia, arguably the world. And certainly Korean kings and scholars and religious often looked up to China as a model. But by the late 1800s, China had become relatively weak compared to European powers and even to the rapidly developing and industrializing Japan. So China was called the sick man of East Asia at that time. So Yoon Chi-ho advocated Korea breaking away from Chinese influence and adopting Western influence instead, like importing science, industry, political ideas, and so on. And he also opposed Confucianism, which he blamed in large part for Korea's weakness, poverty, and being kind of stuck in its past or traditions. During the period of Japanese occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945, The Japanese did revive the Korean Royal Confucian Academy, but they used it as a tool to impose Japanese culture on Koreans, which led some Koreans to critique Confucianism on that basis as well. There's also been continued survival, though, and of Confucianism in Korean culture, and some new modern takes or revisions of it. The Korean Baek Eun-sik, who lived from 1859 to 1925, was a historian by trade, but he was also the president of the Korean government exile in Shanghai, China, during the period of Japanese domination of the peninsula. He advocated the view of the Chinese Neo-Confucian Wang Yangming that people should cultivate their heart-mind, or Shin, to uncover the innate goodness within them. And he thought this was a vision that would be good for all humans, not just those of China or Korea or any particular culture. So he was trying to make it a kind of universal modern philosophy that might appeal to all nations. Kim Chong-yol was a philosophy professor and a pro-democracy activist in South Korea in the 1970s and 1980s. He advocated Confucianism as a corrective to what he regarded as the excesses of capitalism, because in the Confucian tradition, there is very much a sense of hierarchy and order, and people of lower status obeying and respecting people of higher status. But there's also the idea that people of higher status or authority must protect and care for and educate, support those beneath them. And moreover, Confucianism as a tradition has been, for the most part, very critical of merchants and wealth accumulation, and suspicious of the kind of corrosive effect of that kind of greed, which Kim Jong-il associated with modern critiques of capitalism. The Korean Confucian So Chong-gi advocated a new Confucianism for everyone, for the people, rather than just the traditional elites like kings, officials, or scholars. There was also the Institute of Confucian Cultural Studies in South Korea, which has revived scholars' interest in Confucianism. You see this a bit in modern China as well. Kind of new appraisals of Confucianism, which previously was often critiqued, especially in the People's Republic of China, which is ruled by the Communist Party, and especially under Mao Zedong. He was a very harsh critic of Confucianism, thought of it as an outdated feudal ideology that was keeping China back. But in more recent decades, in the People's Republic of China, you've seen the government support Confucian culture as a kind of hallmark of traditional Chinese culture and civilization generally. You see a kind of similar reappraisal happening in Korea. And you could argue, I think this is true, that Confucianism is actually more of a living tradition in South Korea than it is in most of the People's Republic of China, just because, especially during the Cultural Revolution in China in the 1960s, Confucianism and other aspects of traditional Chinese culture like Buddhism and Taoism were really harshly attacked and suppressed. And so Confucianism largely died out in China at that time. It was still preserved by various overseas Chinese communities, like in Southeast Asia or Pacific coast of North America, for example, like in San Francisco and so on. But in South Korea as well, Confucianism never really died out. So there's still like Confucian primary schools and things like that. Buddhism was controlled and regulated during the Japanese occupation of Korea. In 1911, the Japanese government enacted a law called the Temple Ordinance, in which Buddhist abbots, or the heads of Buddhist monasteries, were given rights of ownership and inheritance. In other words, they made the monastery private property. Buddhist abbots were also allowed to marry. Basically, they're trying to secularize the Buddhist clergy, make them not a separate kind of like legal institution, and just assimilate them into the rest of society as property owners and heads of families. Similarly, in 1920, there was another Japanese temple ordinance in which the government directly seized control of the 31 main Buddhist temples in Korea. After the Japanese occupation, there was a division among the Buddhist clergy in South Korea. Buddhism was largely suppressed in North Korea, but it survived in South Korea. But nevertheless, there was division between orders of monks who had adopted the Japanese rules, for example, married clergy, and those who did not. Buddhism traditionally requires celibacy of all monks and nuns. The Jogye order also gained dominance of Korean Buddhism after the Japanese occupation and took control of Buddhist temples. Another feature of modern Buddhism in South Korea is that there's a lot of missionary activity and various associations run by lay people rather than by clergy, and also youth organizations. And all of these features show the influence actually of Protestant Christianity, like Korean Methodism and Presbyterianism and other sects of Korean Protestant Christianity, which have been very influential in South Korean culture generally. There was also some restoring and rebuilding of temples after the period of Japanese occupation. An example of a modern Korean Buddhist sect is Won Buddhism. This is a modern sect which emphasizes a meditation practice like the traditional Seon, but they have their own canon of scriptures and some new doctrines as well. So the founder of Won Buddhism was Sotae-san, who lived from 1891 to 1943, and one of his key teachings is that all beings are of one reality, which is related to some traditional Mahayana doctrines, but it's that kind of overt monism is more kind of like a modern innovation. You can see that the picture on the slide of a Won Buddhist altar. The circle is often a symbol of Won Buddhism, and it's similar to traditional Zen Buddhist calligraphy, which sometimes uses that as a symbol of emptiness or of the wisdom of enlightenment. But just showing the complete circle like that is very characteristic of Won Buddhism. So, in terms of religious affiliation in modern South Korea, from a 2021 Gallup poll, 60% identified as having no religion. That was actually up from data even just a decade prior to that. Like a lot of other developed nations around the world, religions are basically gradually declining in South Korea. Protestant Christianity made up 17% of the population, Buddhism 16%, Catholicism or Catholic Christianity 6%, and other 1%. Other would include new religions and specific sects of Korean shamanism, for example. Only 15% of Koreans identified as atheists, though, in a 2012 survey. So many of those who don't identify as religious may still believe in God or other religious beings. So Confucianism and shamanism are not reflected in that Gallup poll. They're still practiced, but they're not usually claimed as the basis for religious identity. Although Confucianism is recognized officially as a religion in South Korea. There are also a bunch of smaller new religions in Korea. These often combine elements of Mugyo, Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and or Christianity. An example of that is Cheongdogyo, the religion of the heavenly way, which is based on the Donghak movement of Choe Jae-u, which originated in 1860, although it has earlier precursors from earlier in the 19th century, including some peasant revolts and movements. It was founded in part as a reaction or response to Christianity, combining the idea of heaven or a heavenly way with some elements of Confucianism and Mugyo or Korean shamanism. So it advocates self-cultivation along Confucian lines. Confucianism is largely a philosophy of moral self-cultivation or moral self-development for the sake of individual flourishing and social harmony. But Cheongdogyo advocates self-cultivation for this more transcendent goal of moving a person closer to Cheon or heaven. And the religion also worships heaven as the unity or oneness of the universe. They also emphasize the equality of all people, and that particular teaching probably reflects a Christian influence. Cheongdogyo is one of the few religions also practiced in North Korea. My understanding of this is that Cheongdogyo in North Korea was an early supporter of the communist government there, and so that's why they were kind of tolerated. Another new religion is Daejongyo, or the religion of the great ancestors. This was founded by Na Chol in 1910. It's a revival of Mugyo or shamanism, but it's an organized sect as opposed to just a kind of diffuse cultural practice, unlike Mugyo in general. In Daejongyo, Hwanin, Hwanong, and Tangun are regarded as an alternative to the Christian Trinity. So they're kind of like a shamanistic trinity of gods. Another example of a Korean new religion is Dan Yoga. This was founded by Il-Chi Lee in 1985. It's actually a commercialized health and fitness program rather than a traditional religion, but it's very much influenced by Taoist internal alchemy or Neidan principles. Another example of a Korean new religion is the Unification Church. This is basically a sect of Christianity that has distinctive beliefs. Other Christians would regard it as heretical, but it was founded by Sun Myung Moon, who lived from 1920 to 2012. He regarded himself as the second coming of Jesus Christ and as the so-called true father. In his book Divine Principle, Moon claimed he had a vision of Jesus Christ in which Jesus asked Moon to continue Jesus's work on earth, which had been interrupted by the tragedy of his crucifixion. And in particular, Sun Myung Moon taught that he and his wife, Hak Ja Han, would create a new human lineage free from sin. So Sun Myung Moon has the title of True Father in the Unification Church, and his wife, Hak Ja Han, has the title True Mother. And they thought that they were free from original sin and that their children would give new hope to humanity, and they were somehow part of Jesus's plan for salvation. The Unification Church is also famous for its mass wedding ceremonies, which is part of their idea of kind of like repopulating the earth or creating a sort of new human race that's free from original sin. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Japanese religions, and we'll start with just a general introduction to the island chain of Japan and an overview of traditional Japanese religions. Japan is an island chain with four main islands. Honshu, the largest, has the main Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples in southern Honshu, especially around the old capitals of Kyoto and Nara. Kyushu contains some of the oldest historical sites in Japan because of its proximity to Korea. Shikoku contains a famous Buddhist pilgrimage route. Hokkaido in the north was the last of the main islands to be settled by ethnic Yamato or Japanese people. The indigenous people are called Ainu. There are still some of them left, and they have some of their own traditions as well. Traditional Japanese religion is or was a combination of Shinto and Buddhism. Shinto is the indigenous religion of Japan. Buddhism was brought to Japan primarily from Korea and China. Traditionally, Confucianism was also influential in Japanese religion and culture. The Japanese forms of Buddhism are influenced by Chinese and Korean schools of Buddhism like Pure Land and Chan, and by Confucianism. So in terms of religious identity, most Japanese don't identify as religious because most are not members of an organized religious sect or shugyo. However, most Japanese people do participate in Shinto and Buddhism in that they celebrate Shinto and Buddhist festivals, pray at Shinto shrines, and perform Buddhist ceremonies honoring their ancestors. And this is so even if they don't identify as religious. There's a name for syncretizing or combining Buddhism and Shinto in Japanese, Shinbutsu Shugo, which literally means the God Buddha religion. Shin for God or spirit, Butsu for Buddhist. And this was traditionally practiced by most Japanese up till modern times. There's still a large fraction of Japanese who are registered with a Buddhist temple, even if they're not particularly devout. Um, and only a small percentage of Japanese are members of a Shinto sect. But as mentioned, many participate in Shinto festivals or pray at Shinto shrines and so on. The picture on the slide is of the Daibutsu, or Great Buddha, at Kotoko-in Temple in Kamakura, one of the major Buddhist temples in Japan. So now we're going to talk about the ancient, including prehistoric eras of Japanese history, which is basically the origins of what later became classified as Shintoism, or the Shinto religion. Prehistoric Japan includes two main periods, Jomon and Yayoi. Jomon is the oldest, lasting from around 14,000 to 300 BC. The people who lived in the Japanese islands were hunter-gatherers, and they practiced some early forms of farming. They had a distinctive cord-marked pottery. The Yayoi period lasted from around 300 BC to around 300 AD. This period is initiated from migration to the islands of Japan from the Korean peninsula. These migrants brought rice cultivation, and thus they were able to have a denser population. And they also brought a new language. Linguistically, Japanese is not that closely related to any other language, but the language that it's most closely related to is Korean. I've read that it actually is related to an ancient Korean language that is no longer spoken. Essentially, there were multiple related languages in ancient Korea. One of them was brought over to Japan by the Yayoi, but modern Korean is actually descended from one of the other ancient Korean languages. The picture on the slide is of magatama beads or gemstones from the Jomon period. This style of kidney bean, or almost like embryo-shaped gem, is used later in Japanese culture as well. The first historical period in Japan is known as the Yamato, named after the Yamato kingdom. This was a kingdom of the Yayoi that united much of the island of Honshu. The Yamato kings adopted the title of Tenno. Literally it means heavenly sovereign, but it's usually translated as emperor. And the modern emperors of Japan are actually descended from those ancient Yamato kings. Although they are mainly ceremonial figures now, there's been a continual dynasty back to the founding, essentially, of the Yamato kingdom. Prince Shotoku was the imperial regent of the Yamato kingdom from 593 to 622 AD. And he was the one who gave official support to Buddhism. And essentially, Buddhism was already practiced a little bit in Japan. It had been brought over by Korean merchants before, but this was when the imperial government started to practice Buddhism, and it was really practiced alongside Shinto. So it wasn't like Buddhism replaced Shinto. For the most part, the imperial government, the nobles, the elites, as well as commoners, would practice Buddhism alongside Shinto. Although Buddhism mainly started spreading in the imperial capital among the nobles and the imperial family, and it was more of a gradual process of spreading to the common people over the next several centuries. So I've been using this name Shinto. It's the Japanese name for the way of the spirits. It's actually based on the Chinese words shun for spirit and Dao for way. Japan adopted a lot of the language and writing and culture and literature, to a certain extent, the philosophy and religion from China, going back to at least the Yamato period. And so some of the religious terminology, especially in Japanese, is based on Chinese terms. So ironically, Shinto is the indigenous or native religious tradition of Japan, but the name for the religion is based on the Chinese name Shun Dao, the way of the spirits. So it's a type of animism where there's many different spirits and gods associated with natural phenomena such as mountains, trees, animals, rivers, seas, etc., that are worshipped in the shrines. So you can clearly distinguish Buddhism from Shinto, even though they get combined later on. But Shinto is the tradition native to Japan, whereas Buddhism was brought over later from Korea and China. And also, Shinto is the religion focused on worshiping the kami, or gods, at special jinja, or shrines. The picture on the slide is of Prince Yamato no Takero with the mystical sword Kusanagi, who was given to him by some of the kami, or gods. This Kusanagi sword is one of the imperial regalia. The others include a magatama, or gem, and a mirror that, according to tradition, are still possessed by the emperors of Japan, although they were originally brought down to earth from heaven by the kami. So this word kami is the Japanese word for God or spirits. And there are many different types of kami. What they all have in common is that they are sacred beings. So there's the O-kami, the great kami, or gods, many of whom are mentioned in ancient texts known as the Kojiki or the Nihon-gi, also known as the Nihon Shoki. These include creator gods like Izanagi and Izanami, Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, who, according to tradition, is the ancestor of the emperors of Japan, and her brother Susanoo, the god of storms. Kami can also include natural objects or places, such as mountains like Mount Fuji or Fujisan, springs, rocks, and so on. Some kami are legendary or historical persons, such as Jimmu, who was an ancient emperor of Japan. Similar in a way with Chinese religion, where famous humans can ascend to the level of the gods after their death, like the god of war, Guandi, for example, in Chinese religion started out as a human general. There are persons, legendary or historical, in Japan that ascend to the ranks of kami after their death. Also, in general, the Tenno, or emperors of Japan, are regarded as living kami, in large part because of the tradition that they're descended from Amaterasu. And then finally, there are sacred objects that are regarded as kami, like the aforementioned Kusanagi sword. The object may be hidden in a jinja, or shrine, in an inner sanctuary, not actually on display. But sometimes there is an object in which the kami is believed to dwell. Those are actually often placed on the altars that are visible in jinja. These are some examples of kami, most of them in the form of the gods, or O-kami. Ebusu, or Hiriko, is the god of the sea and fishermen. Amaterasu is the goddess of the sun. Tsukuyomi, her brother, is the god of the moon. Susanoo, her other brother, is the god of storms. One of the other main kami, whose picture you can see on the slide, is Inari. Inari is the kami of foxes and rice, fertility of the land, and sake, or rice wine, as well as of tea and fortune or good luck. Hachiman is the kami of warriors, while Tenjin is the kami of scholars. Tenjin is also an example of a human historical person who ascended to the rank of kami after his death. So Shinto is mainly an oral tradition. It doesn't have a canonical scripture like the Bible or the Quran or the Veda. It is like a lot of other customary or folk religions that were just passed down over the generations as part of the broader culture. However, there are two early texts and some of the first two works of Japanese literature, in fact, that contain Shinto myths, stories, and names of some of the kami. These are the Kojiki, which was authored in 712 AD, and the Nihongi or Nihon Shoki, which was authored in 720 AD. So these both contain creation myths. The creation myth in the Kojiki is interesting. There's a kind of succession of different heavenly beings, a kind of whole lineage of different generations of gods before you get to the creation of the islands of Japan. The creator gods come from Takamagahara, which is this high heavenly realm. Some of the early generations of gods are the Koto Amatsu Akami. These are three distinguishing heavenly gods. That's what their name means. And then there's also the Kamiyo Nanayo, 7 generations of the age of the gods after them. And it's only after the Kamiyo Nanayo that you get Izanagi and Izanami, who were brother and sister, but they were also husband and wife. And they created the 8 main islands of Japan with a mystical jeweled spear. So you can see in the picture on the slide, Izanagi, he's holding a spear, he's dipping it into the ocean, and he's able to draw a land from the salt of the sea and gradually build up the islands of Japan. So there's a shrine actually marking this creation event. And it's not technically the creation of the whole world, but Izanagi and Izanami are regarded as having created the islands of Japan and many other islands besides, as well as parenting many other gods and goddesses. So there's many other stories about the kami, both in the Kojiki and other texts, and some stories of the kami are just passed down orally or a part of later traditions as well. So one of the famous stories is of the marriage of Izanagi and Izanami. So the first time they were going to marry and then procreate, there was an error in the dance they were performing. So sacred dance is a big part of Shinto. A lot of Shinto ceremonies involve a dance, sometimes performed by a priest or a shrine maiden, which is another type of Shinto clergy. And the error that was made in this wedding dance was that Izanami spoke to Izanagi first, and that was regarded as inappropriate, rather than Izanagi, the male, speaking to Izanami first. So the first time they mated, they gave birth to a kind of mutant child known as Hiruko, sometimes called the leech baby. So it didn't have like normal bones. It was sort of eel-like or leech-like. And they cast it into the sea, although it eventually survived and became the god of the sea and fisherman Ebisu. But then they did the ritual properly, the mating ritual, and they had many, many children. Many islands were born by them, as well as kami spirits. Eventually, however, Izanami died after giving birth to Kagutsuchi, the god of fire. Izanagi was so angry at Kagutsuchi for killing his wife that he actually killed Kagutsuchi with his sword, although Kagutsuchi basically still survived and lived on as the kami of fire. Izanagi was very distraught, though, at the death of his wife, Izanami. She essentially died because she was burned from the inside by her son, Kagutsuchi, who was, the kami of fire, so he was born on fire. In any event, after she died, Izanagi traveled to Yomi, the land of the dead, the underworld, to try to retrieve Izanami. This task failed. He was able to beat her, but she had to inquire about whether it would be okay for her to return to the land of the living. And she warned Izanagi to not try to turn around and look at her before she was able to get back to him. He did look and saw that her body was actually decaying. He became horrified, ran away, and then, in addition to being chased by Izanami, who was kind of ashamed and angry, there were a bunch of these other kind of monstrous women or hags or ogres that were chasing Izanagi. So he ran back out of the underworld, and the underworld is pictured as kind of like an underground realm, like a giant cave. But there was a mouth, the opening of the cave leading to the surface world. And after Izanagi ran through that, he found a large stone to block the entrance so he wouldn't be chased out he wouldn't be chased after by those ogresses who were trying to pursue him. And that stone is what keeps the land of the living away from the land of the world of the dead. Well, after his contact with the land of the dead, Izanagi was unclean. So there's a notion in Shinto, like a lot of other indigenous religions or ancient cultures, that the dead are unclean. And so he had to purify himself through a ceremony called misogi. And he did this in running fresh water, which is also still done in Shinto today. There are purification ceremonies you can perform in like a mountain stream or waterfall, for example. Just by performing this purification ceremony, he by himself was able to give birth to additional kami. From his two eyes came Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, and Tsukuyomi, the god of the moon. And from his nose came Susanoo, the god of rain and storms. So Susanoo was a sort of violent, aggressive god, as is befitting. A lot of storms will hit the Japanese coast coming off the ocean. So he was associated with the violence of those sea storms. And he was kind of so aggressive or unstable that he was going to be kicked out of heaven. He was ordered to leave, and he wanted to say goodbye to his sister Amaterasu before he left. But when he appeared, she wasn't sure what his intentions were, and so she dressed in the armor and weapons of a warrior in case she had to protect herself. But Susanoo was very offended by this. He thought his sister didn't love or trust him, and so he actually wanted to have a contest, a kind of ritual contest to prove that he was sincere and that what he was saying was true and that he wasn't going to harm his sister. So this is a reference to an ancient custom, like kind of like trial that you could undergo to prove your sincerity or innocence. And they were gods, so their contest was each one was going to try to use an item that belonged to the other and see how many new gods they could create from that item. So Amaterasu grabbed Susanoo's comb that was in his hair, and from each of the teeth on the comb, she made another kami or god. Susanoo grabbed the necklace of magatama, or little beads or gemstones that Amaterasu was wearing, and from each of those beads made a god. Now it turns out Susanoo actually made more kami from Amaterasu's necklace than she made from the teeth of his comb. So he said, I won. I've won the contest. I've proven my sincerity and truthfulness. But Amaterasu disagreed. She said, well, you used my necklace, my string of magatama to create those gods, so they're really mine, so I won the contest. And then this sent her brother Susanoo into a violent rage. He ran all around the cosmos, causing havoc. He actually killed a heavenly horse and threw the body of the horse on his sister's loom where she would do weaving. Actually, one of her servants was weaving at that loom at the time, and her servant was killed by the flayed horse. Amaterasu was very upset, very distraught. She was so upset she hid herself away in a cave. And she was the goddess of the sun, so the whole world went dark. The other kami were upset about this because they realized that life couldn't persist if the sun never came back. So they went to the cave, tried to persuade her to come out. She was still too upset and angry. She wouldn't do it. So then they decided to get strategic and try to arouse her interest and curiosity to get her to leave the cave voluntarily. So they had this large celebration or party. They had a raucous song and dance. They all laughed, and they also said that they saw the most beautiful kami they had ever seen at the party. And then this really got Amaterasu's attention. One, they were having fun, they were celebrating, they were laughing. But two, there was someone supposedly more beautiful than her outside of the cave. So she opens up the rock blocking the cave. They actually show her own reflection in a mirror. So she thinks she's seeing this other more beautiful spirit, but it's really her own reflection. But nevertheless, she comes out of the cave and light is returned to the world. You can see an image of Amaterasu emerging from the cave in the picture on the slide on the left. Susanoo eventually had to leave heaven, but he was remorseful for what he had done. And he decided to come to Earth, though. Eventually, he was able to apologize to his sister. But when he came to Earth, he first encountered an old couple that were crying. And the reason why they were crying is because they had many daughters, but each daughter had been devoured by this water dragon who was very hungry and was always coming around looking for a meal. They only had one daughter left. Well, Susanoo, partly because he was an honorable warrior, partly because he wanted to help give himself a better reputation, decided, I'm going to kill this dragon. I'm going to help out this couple that's mourning, and save their last daughter. So he actually came up with a plot. He set a scheme. He told the elderly couple who were farmers, brew some sake or rice wine, put it in big barrels, and leave it out for the dragon. The dragon came back. It actually devoured all of these barrels of sake, got drunk. When it was drunk, it couldn't defend itself, and so that's when Susanoo attacked it, was able to kill it, and he was looking at the corpse of this water dragon. He actually found in the skin or the hide between the scales of the dragon the mystical sword Kusanagi, which he then gave to his sister Amaterasu as a gift of apology for the havoc that he had wreaked and the bad things he had done. She accepted it and later on would give it to her own descendants, who would eventually include the emperors of Japan. So you can get a sense from these stories of the different kami, their personality. They're superhuman, but they're kind of human-like. A lot of these stories are a big part of Japanese culture and tradition, even if they're not necessarily taken literally. The emperor or Tenno of Japan has played a central role in the Shinto religion since the period of the Yamato kingdom. So according to tradition, Ninigi, who is the grandson of Amaterasu, was the ancestor of the emperors of Japan. And Jimmu, the first actual emperor, was the great-grandson of Ninigi. So it's an indirect or multi-generational divide between Jimmu and Amaterasu, but there's still a connection between the kami and the emperors of Japan. So the main Shinto shrine associated with the emperor is the Ise Grand Shrines. It's a collection of shrines that honor the sun goddess Amaterasu, and because of the imperial connection, they also are associated with the imperial family. There's still a custom in Japan when there's a new prime minister elected in the parliament, they report on the formation of their government or cabinet to the emperor by going to the Ise Grand Shrine. So Shinto is the religion focusing on worshiping the kami at jinja or shrines. In general, each jinja or shrine honors a particular kami. Some are worshipped all throughout Japan, like Amaterasu, Susanoo, the other main kami or gods. But there's also jinja that just honor a local kami. Some kami are only honored at one shrine. It just kind of varies. Others are local or regional, like Mount Fuji has a network of shrines around it that are all within a sight of Mount Fuji. So there's just variation there on how prevalent the worship of the kami are. The kami can be connected with natural phenomena, with historical events, or with acts of personal devotion or patronage in terms of why the jinja was built at a particular spot. A couple of other examples of shrines. Kashima Shrine is near the Pacific coast of Honshu. It honors Take Mikazuchi, the god of thunder and swords. And this is a shrine that is patronized by martial artists, such as those traditionally who practice kendo, the art or way of the sword, which was associated with that particular kami. Now, Kashima Shrine is a large area. It contains many sub-shrines. One of those shrines celebrates a spring of fresh water flowing out of the side of the hill. Another is a fenced enclosure that surrounds a stone. Only the top of the stone is visible above the sand. It's common practice to have areas around shrines covered in sand or gravel. And that stone that's visible is supposed, according to tradition, to hold in place a giant catfish or namazu that is the cause of earthquakes in Japan whenever that buried catfish moves around under the stone, according to tradition. You can see a picture on the slide of a Roman or two-story gate that marks the entrance to Kashima Shrine. Another example of a famous shrine is Izumo, which is dedicated to Okoni Nushi, the chief kami of the earth, and also associated with marriage. A lot of the kami, you go to a specific kami based on your needs, what you're praying for, basically. So there are some general features of Shinto shrines. Most shrines, they have a torii or symbolic gate marking the entrance or the area around a shrine. Some will have even a series of torii that you pass through as you get closer and closer to the main shrine area. Shrines also will generally have a water pavilion. So this will have a trough of clean water underneath a roof, and there'll be ladles for worshippers to wash their face and hands because it's a Shinto ceremony to purify yourself before praying. Just like Izanagi had to purify himself in fresh running water after he returned from the land of the dead, before you honor or pray to the kami, you need to wash off the spiritual dust, so to speak, that's accumulated on you. There's the Haiden or worship hall. This is a larger structure that can be entered by groups or individuals, often those seeking the priest resident there to make a special petitionary prayer on their behalf to the kami. There's also the Honden or main hall. This is usually behind the worship hall. It's smaller. It's not actually physically entered by worshippers, but it's the place where where the kami is believed to dwell. So when you would worship the kami, it would usually be just outside the honden. You would stand outside the worship hall, toss a coin into the offering box. This is kind of a symbolic small offering. Larger offerings can be made at the honden. There's always a bell there, so the custom is to pull on the bell, clap twice, bow, clap again, and then leave. The bell and the claps are meant to alert the kami of the worshipper's presence. This is an example of an ancient aspect of Shinto practice. Shinto is an ever-evolving tradition, so some of the particular ceremonies, even some of the particular kami and stories about them, are relatively more recent, maybe even within the last couple of centuries. However, we have ancient Chinese literature that describes people visiting Japan and seeing them worshiping in this way with clapping. So that goes back, I believe, to the Han Dynasty, so more than 2,000 years. And that just shows you that a lot of these customs of Shinto are very ancient. Other things you may see at a Shinto shrine are shimenawa. This is a thick hempen rope that's usually placed in front of the worship hall. There can also be rocks or trees decked with shimenawa if they are regarded as dwelling places for the kami. So the rope is kind of symbolically marking off the boundary of the sacred area to the kami. You also may see shide or folded white paper strips that look kind of like bolts of lightning. Now we're going to talk about the development of Japanese religion during the Nara and Heian periods. The Nara period lasted from 710 to 794 AD. It's named after the city of Nara, which served as the imperial capital at that time. It was and still is to an extent a center of Buddhism. The other main center of Buddhism is Kyoto, which is the current imperial capital and has been since the Heian period. During the Nara period, the emperor and nobles of Japan modeled themselves after Tang Dynasty China in terms of much of their culture, religion, and system of government, creating an imperial bureaucracy, for example, similar to that of traditional China. This is when they adopted the Chinese characters as a system of writing. Later on, Japanese developed additional syllabic alphabets of their own. but they still use kanji or characters of Chinese in their writing as well. The earliest works of Japanese literature were written purely in Chinese, though. These include the aforementioned Kojiki, or Record of Ancient Matters, and Nihon Shoki, or Chronicles of Japan, both of which contain stories about the kami. Nihon Shoki also contains chronicles of the Japanese emperors, but it begins in myth and legend, including a lot of the stories of the kami. In terms of religion, Shinto was the most common religion still in Japan, practiced by everyone from commoners to the nobles and the imperial family. But Buddhism by now had been imported to Japan and was especially popular among the elites in the capital, the imperial family and the various noble clans. The beginnings of the imperial bureaucracy also included a couple of offices that regulated religion. The Jingi Khan governed Shinto shrines, or jinja, and the Songha office governed Buddhist clergy. These bureaus set the precedent for government regulation of religion, which to a certain extent still continues in Japan. The picture on the slide is of Prince Shotoku, who was an important promoter of Buddhism during this period. The Heian period is named after the city of Heian-kyo, now called Kyoto, which was the capital of the emperors in this period. And after that as well, up to modern times, the emperors still live in Kyoto. The Heian period lasted from 794 to 1185. Many of the most important Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples were built in Kyoto in this period and after, because even after the emperors lost the actual political power, it was later taken over by samurai clans who were ruled by a supreme lord or shogun. Still, Kyoto remained the cultural and religious capital of Japan. A lot of the culture was focused around the imperial family and the various noble clans who lived in Kyoto. An example, though, of a famous temple in Kyoto is Chion-in, which is the chief temple of the Jodo-shu sect of Japanese Buddhism, about which more later. So the first two main schools or sects of Japanese Buddhism were Tendai and Jodo-shu. Tendai was the first prominent type of Buddhism. It's the Japanese name of Tiantai. This is the sect of Chinese Buddhism that is focused on honoring the Lotus Sutra and worshiping the Bodhisattva Guanyin, who's called Kannon in Japanese. So this was the first version of Buddhism to basically gain support among the noble clans and the imperial family. A little bit later, Jodo-shu, or Pure Land Buddhism, also became popular. This is a sect like Tendai of Mahayana, or Greater Vehicle Buddhism, which is the most common type of Buddhism in East Asia. And it focuses on paying homage or worshiping Amida-butsu, which is the Japanese name of Amidwofo or Amitabha Buddha, the Buddha of the Pure Land. The idea is you recite the Nembutsu, which is a mantra or prayer honoring Amida-butsu, and then the Buddha will allow you to be reborn in your next life in a pure land that he's created. And from there you can learn about the Dharma or teaching of Buddhism straight from the mouth of the Buddha Amida himself, and from there you'll be able to attain nirvana or enlightenment more swiftly. The Jodo-shu sect was established in Japan by the monk Honen, who lived from 1133 to 1212. And both of these prominent early sects of Japanese Buddhism were basically Japanese forms of Chinese Buddhist sects. The third main sect of Buddhism to reach Japan was Shingon, which is the Japanese version of Chunyan. Chunyan is the Chinese name for Vajrayana Buddhism. Chunyan is Chinese for true word, which means mantra. And this is a type of Buddhism that focuses on esoteric or secret mantras or prayers and other practices that are believed to give a more swift and direct path to enlightenment. The chief temple of Shingon Buddhism is on Mount Goya. And Shingon was established in Japan by the monk Kukai, who lived from 744 to 835. He's known posthumously as Kobo Daishi. Now, even though Shingon was established earlier than Jodo Shu, it's not as prominent or common. It's always been a kind of a minority sect in Japanese Buddhism, but it still has a lot of prestige to it. A bit more about the Pure Land or Jodo Shu sect of Buddhism. Genshin, who lived from 942 to 1017, was a Tendai monk who actually helped found the Pure Land sect in Japan. So this is the Japanese version of Chinese Pure Land Buddhism. For both versions of the sect, the central practice is a mantra or prayer involving reciting the name of Amida or Amitabha Buddha. In Japanese, that's Namu Amida Butsu. This prayer or mantra is called the Nembutsu in Japanese. The idea of Pure Land Buddhism is that Buddhists are living in the Mappo or end times, in which the Dharma of the Buddha has fallen into decline. People are no longer able to save themselves by their own self power, jiriki. Rather, they have to rely on the grace of the Buddha, on other power or tariki. This is the only way of attaining enlightenment in the Mappo. And specifically, they advocate prayer to Amida Buddha in order for the person praying to be reborn in the Pure Land. This is a Buddha realm, a universe created by the power of Amida Buddha. And once reborn there, beings can hear the Dharma directly from the mouth of Amida Buddha. And it's a very peaceful, serene realm that provides a better platform from which to attain nirvana or enlightenment. Genshin authored a book called Essentials of Birth in the Pure Land, which made quite an impact. Among other things, it described the different realms of rebirth or reincarnation in Buddhist belief, including vivid, frightening descriptions of the torments of the hell realms that one would go through before reaching the Pure Land. Honen, who lived from 1133 to 1212, helped found the school of Jodo Shu as well. So Genshin was technically a Tendai monk, for example, whereas Honen was ordained in the Jodo Shu sect. He taught that lay people and monks have equal access to the grace of Amida Buddha. So he was making the teaching more radical in a sense, opening up the possibility of enlightenment not just to monks but also to lay people. Pure Land Buddhism in general somewhat equalizes the status of monks or ascetics and lay people because they can both equally pray the Nembutsu. But Honen just really emphasized that aspect even more. This scandalized the monks of the Tendai sect, who were the most influential sect of Buddhism in the imperial capital of Kyoto. They arranged for Honen to be banished from the capital, Kyoto, for 4 years in the year 1207. And later on, after the death of Honen, there were monks from the Tendai sect who even desecrated his grave and burned copies of his written works in the year 1227. So this shows you some of the intense rivalry that happened between the different Buddhist sects. And a lot of this was fighting for control and influence over the imperial court, the noble clans, and later among the samurai or warrior clans. A big part of Japanese Buddhism is worshiping Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. One of the main ones is Jizo. This is the Japanese name of Dizang. That's the Chinese name. The Sanskrit name is Kshitigarbha. This is a Buddha who cares for sentient beings who are suffering in the hell realms because of their past bad karma. In Japanese Buddhism, Jizo is also a protector of children, travelers, and infants who died during childbirth or pregnancy, including because of abortion. There's a practice in Japanese Buddhism of people leaving offerings at statues or icons of Jizo, which may be placed outside, but they would set out fruit for the Jizo icon. And there's also a custom of knitting caps and kind of scarves or bibs for the icons. Another really important bodhisattva in Japanese Buddhism is Kannon. This is the Japanese name of Guanyin or Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, the bodhisattva of compassion. Kannon is a compassionate, loving being who offers protection and solace for those who pray to her. She's the primary bodhisattva worshipped in Tendai Buddhism, and her veneration is also very big in Soto Zen. You can see the picture on the slide, a very ancient statue of Kannon from Todai-ji Temple in Nara that dates back to the 8th century. This statue is also interesting because it's flanked by the devas or gods, Brahma and Indra. Brahma is the creator god in Hinduism, and Indra is the king of the devas or gods. Buddhism does not primarily focus on worshiping gods like Brahma and Indra, but they can be regarded as protectors or supporters of the Buddha. Also emerging during the Nara and Heian periods was Shugendo. Shugendo is a syncretic sect that combines features of Buddhism and Shinto together with some other influences, like some Taoist metaphysics like yin yang and things like that. It includes ascetic exercises aimed at attaining enlightenment, and the practitioners of Shugendo believe that they can gain magical powers. They also have shamanic style rituals that they can perform, healing using ki or energy, firewalking rituals, and the kind of blending of these different traditions together with mystical practices has influenced many of the newer religions in Japan as well. The picture on the slide is of Yamabushi. Literally, this means mountain warriors, but it's a name given for certain types of clergy, including Shugendo ascetics. Now we're going to talk about Japanese religion during the Kamakura period. This was the period in which the samurai or warrior clans came to prominence and ended up seizing power from the emperors. The Kamakura period lasted from 1185 to 1333. It started when the samurai lord Minamoto Yoritomo defeated the rival samurai clan Taira and the noble clan Fujiwara and became the first shogun or military ruler of Japan. Now, previous to this, the samurai clan Taira had dominated the government, but they did not have the title of shogun. So Kamakura became the center of power or the capital of the new shogun. That's why the period is named after it. However, the emperor continued to live in the imperial capital of Kyoto, where he does to this day. One of the ideas you see spread through the Kamakura period is that of the Mappo or end times. Buddhist cosmology is cyclic. The universe is created by Brahma, a creator god, who's not all-powerful or all-knowing. He's a being in samsara, just like us, but more powerful. But after the creation of the universe, it lasts for a long time. Eventually, it will be destroyed and recreated by another Brahma. It's just a cycle that keeps repeating without real purpose or goal forever. So there's also a theory of stages of the progress within one of those world systems over time. So the Mappo is the concept that our current age is coming to an end before the Dharma will be restored by another Buddha. Connected to the doctrine of the cosmic cycle, the creation, preservation, destruction, and recreation of the cosmos, there's a notion that the Dharma itself, or the teaching of a Buddha, does not last forever. In a sense, the Dharma is always there, but the idea is that it declines over time after it's been initially taught by a Buddha, as people forget it, misinterpret it, etc. And also, as the Dharma declines, the world generally becomes more chaotic, violent, sinful before the Dharma is restored by another Buddha. Well, in Japan, the end times were predicted to begin in 1052. And this was later used to interpret the chaotic end to the Heian period, the previous period before Kamakura, in which you had a lot of fighting between the Taira and Minamoto clans. During the Kamakura period, there were new Buddhist sects founded that became the most important in Japanese Buddhism: Pure Land, Nichiren, and Zen. Also, it's during the Kamakura period that Buddhism spread among the common people, not just among the nobles and elites in the capitals. So there's another type of Pure Land Buddhism called True Pure Land, or Jodo Shinshu. This was founded by Shinran. He was actually a disciple or follower of Honen. Shinran took the idea of a lack of dichotomy between monks and laypeople one step further. He married even though he was a monk, which is violating the vows of celibacy that Buddhist monks are traditionally supposed to abide by. His reasoning, again, was in part that Amida's grace is not going to stop with celibacy. You still have access to Amida's grace, even if you're married, as long as you recite the Nembutsu. He was banished from Kyoto for 7 years, so controversial were his teachings. He also taught that a single recitation of the Nembutsu could give you salvation. Now, customarily in Pure Land Buddhism, you have to recite the mantra thousands of times for it to have its effect. However, the idea of Shinran is that as long as you recite it with perfect sincerity of heart once, then Amida will basically let you be reborn in the Pure Land. True Pure Land spread to the countryside even more widely than Pure Land had, and it was practiced by small groups of lay people who recited the Nembutsu together. So it could be practiced without a lot of intervention of monks, even though there were clergy in this sect as well. And even if it was being suppressed by the authorities, it could still spread because of the very simple practice. Another sect of Japanese Buddhism that came to prominence in the Kamakura was Rinzai Zen. Zen is the Japanese name for Chan Buddhism. This is a sect of Chinese Buddhism dedicated to meditation practice, or Chan. Rinzai is the Japanese name for the Linji school of Chan. There were traditionally around 8 schools of Chan Buddhism, although only 2 survived after the Tang dynasty in China, and they became known in their Japanese versions as Rinzai and Soto. Eisai was originally a Japanese monk of the Tendai sect. He lived from 1141 to 1215. He traveled to China because he wanted to learn more about Tendai and Shingon, or Vajrayana Buddhism. But when he was in China, he discovered Linji Chan, and he brought back knowledge of this sect of Buddhism to Japan, where it's known as Rinzai Zen. He also brought back the practice of drinking tea or cha to Japan from China. And tea drinking became common among Zen Buddhists because it helped them stay alert and awake when they were meditating for long periods. So there's a bunch of Japanese names for concepts from Zen Buddhism. Zazen means seated meditation, which is the basic meditation practice. This is the Japanese version of the Chinese term Zuo-chan. There's also Shikantaza, which is a special type of Buddhist meditation practice in Zen, or Chan. This is meditating without any specific object or theme. Like, rather than focusing on the breath or a visualization or a teaching of the Buddha, there's just sitting, and it's perhaps understandable as advocating directly viewing or confronting your own mind. There's also the concept of a koan, or case record or precedent. This is the Japanese name for going on. So, in a legal context, this means a previous legal ruling that could be used as a later precedent by a judge, for example. But in the case of Zen Buddhism, it means an earlier encounter or dialogue between a master and a student of Zen that's supposed to teach something essential or important about the Zen approach to Buddhism if you reflect on it. These are often puzzling or paradoxical stories, like the question, what is the sound of one hand clapping, that aren't meant to have a rational answer. But there's an understanding in Zen that if you meditate on these scenarios or stories, you will have a spontaneous insight into the nature of enlightenment. Enlightenment is called Satori in Zen Buddhism. And unlike the Pure Land Buddhists, who believe that it's impossible to save yourself or attain enlightenment through your own effort, they basically teach the opposite of that in Zen, that you must and can practice meditation through your own effort to see into your original nature, which is enlightened consciousness. Soto Zen is the Japanese name for Caodong Chan, which was the other main school of Chan Buddhism at the time. It was brought to Japan by Dogen. He was a Japanese monk who lived from 1200 to 1253, also of the Tendai sect. His temple was originally on Mount Hiei. He traveled to Song Dynasty China, and he brought back knowledge of the Soto sect of Zen. The difference between Soto Zen and Rinzai Zen is somewhat subtle in that they both were types of Zen Buddhism. They both emphasize meditation practice. One of the distinctive teachings of Soto Zen, though, was that meditation practice and enlightenment were compatible with daily activities, such as working as a cook in the kitchen, which was a low status job. Dogen had insight into this after speaking to the Tenzo, or head cook, at a monastery in China. He asked an elder monk why he wasn't letting the younger monks or the novices take care of the menial labor of the kitchen, and the monk explained to him that this work he was doing was part of his enlightenment, and that was a kind of aha moment for Dogen. In terms of differences between Soto and Rinzai Zen, Soto Zen also puts relatively less emphasis on meditating on the koan, for example, in comparison to Rinzai Zen. So when he returned to Japan, Dogen founded the Temple of Eiheiji, which is the head temple of the Soto Zen sect in Japan. Soto Zen proved to be popular among the peasants and the rural samurai. It had a more rustic way of life, compatible with labor, compatible even in principle with practicing martial arts, as the samurai or warrior class did. An additional reason for its popularity in later centuries was that in the 15th century, Soto Zen Buddhists adopted the custom of symbolically tonsuring and thus ordaining the corpses of lay people as monks or nuns. So it was a way of gaining the merit of being a Buddhist monk or nun, even if you had lived as a lay person. And then another type of Japanese Buddhism that emerged in the Kamakura period, and like Jodo Shinshu, this is one that was unique to Japan, was Nichiren Buddhism, founded by the monk Nichiren, who lived from 1222 to 1282. So he advocated honoring the Lotus Sutra, similar to Tendai, but Nichiren insisted that honoring the Lotus Sutra is the only way to attain salvation in the Mappo. So he made the Mappo, or end times, the last stage of the Dharma, or teaching of the Buddha, a central theme in his teaching. Another doctrine of Nichiren is three pillars of Buddhism, which are faith, practice, and study. Faith means belief or confidence in the saving power of the Buddha and of the Lotus Sutra. So you can see, again, similarity with the Tendai emphasis on the Lotus Sutra, but Nichiren just has his own kind of more intense, more radical, more fundamentalist, if you will, approach to honoring the Lotus Sutra. The central practice is reciting the mantra Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, which means Hail Wonderful Dharma Lotus Sutra. And the study means studying the Lotus Sutra in particular, but also the writings of Nichiren. Another distinctive thing of Nichiren is he was very harshly critical of other Buddhist sects, basically kind of trash talking them and saying that you had to follow his way if you wanted to attain enlightenment. Also, during the Kamakura period, there were a lot of developments of fine arts and martial arts and other cultural expressions that would be practiced in conjunction with Buddhism or other religions or philosophies. One example of that is Bushido, which means the way of the warrior. Bushi is a word that means warrior, do means way. So this was a later term referring to the philosophy of the samurai class. It included things like honor and self-sacrifice for the sake of your daimyo or lord. But the philosophy of Bushido was also influenced by Confucianism. No is a type of traditional Japanese drama. There are some no plots that have strong Buddhist themes, just as an example. Cha no Yu is the tea ceremony. This is a semi-ritualistic way of preparing and drinking tea, but it was regarded as a type of living art form. And it was perfected by Buddhist monks, especially the abbots or head of the monasteries, especially if they had like samurai or other wealthy patrons who could afford to buy the special vessels in which the tea was prepared and served. You can see the picture on the slide, a modern instantiation of the Cha no Yu. And the tea ceremony was often combined with other art forms, like a scroll that had calligraphy or a painting on it in the back, ikebana or flower arrangements, and not just the words of the poem, but the calligraphy or the style of writing in which it was written. The scrolls that would typically be displayed in the houses or rooms or nooks where the tea would be consumed would generally have a Buddhist theme or message and could include like a gata, a type of traditional Buddhist poem, or another type of Japanese poetic form, but usually one expressing some enlightenment or insight about Buddhism. The ikebana is the art of flower arrangement, and it derived originally from stylized formal offerings of flowers presented as offerings to icons of the Buddhas. And other examples of fine arts that would be practiced by Buddhists and scholars and others interested in religion or philosophy, include calligraphy or the art of fine writing, poetry, and painting, as previously mentioned. Now we're going to talk about Japanese religion during the Sengoku and Edo periods. Those are the last two periods in which the samurai class ruled Japan. The Sengoku was a chaotic period that lasted from around 1467 to 1603, so over a century, and it was a period of near constant civil war and fighting among rival samurai clans. A lot of films or other media set in the samurai era take place during the Sengoku because of all the wars and conflicts. Later on in the Sengoku period, there arose a series of warlords who dominated the other daimyo or samurai lords and eventually paving the way for the creation of a unified government during the Edo period. So during the Sengoku period is when Christianity came to Japan. The first form of Christianity to come was that of the Roman Catholic Church. In 1543, there were some Portuguese sailors who were shipwrecked on the Japanese islands. And after that, the Portuguese came back to trade with Japan, but also they brought some Catholic clergy with them, including members of the Jesuit order. So the Jesuits were really big in the Catholic missionary activity in Asia. They how does their goal? They were trying to convert the whole Japanese nation to Roman Catholicism or Catholic Christianity. Francis Xavier was the leader of the Jesuits in Japan. And the Japanese, some of the Japanese warlords at first welcomed them. They wanted to trade with European merchants, which included the Portuguese, but also later the Dutch, who were Protestant Christians, but they weren't as interested in spreading their religion to the Japanese. The Dutch merchants were mainly just interested in trade. So the main base for the Catholic missions to Japan in the 16th century was in the island of Kyushu, in the west. So eventually, though, there was persecution of Christianity. Some of the lords were suspicious of the Jesuits and the Catholics as trying to get political control or influence, and they began to see the religion possibly as a destabilizing factor. Earlier on, some of the samurai lords had welcomed it, even as a kind of like ally against some of the Buddhist sects, who by this time, some of them had their own private armies and were even fighting the samurai in some of the mountains or more remote areas. But because of the persecutions, there were many martyrs of Japan, especially at the town of Nagasaki. So Catholic Christianity was eventually completely suppressed, in part because it had been associated with a rebellion by some separatist daimyo or lords against the shogun or military ruler of Japan. And it had to go underground for the most part. Tokugawa Ieyasu was the shogun who founded the Edo period. He created the Tokugawa Bakufu or shogunate, which was a new dynasty of samurai lords, essentially, who unified the country. Tokugawa lived from 1548 to 1616. He created a very powerful and centralized state with very strict laws. He wanted to completely order society to prevent a return to the disastrous civil wars and conflict of the Sengoku era. He was also the one who repressed Christianity because he thought of it as a potentially destabilizing influence. Foreigners were not allowed in the country, with the exception of a few Dutch merchants at Dejima Harbor. So Tokugawa, because he regarded the Christians as meddling in politics and as undermining the social order of Japan, initiated the persecution of Christianity. This intensified in the 1620s, and the rebellion that I previously mentioned, the main one that led to the complete elimination of Christianity in Japan, was the Shimabara Rebellion in 1637. There were some samurai lords who rebelled against the shogun, and many of the people who supported them, not all, but many, were Christian. So this led to the death of 25,000 Shimabara rebels, most of whom were Christian. All the Portuguese were expelled from the islands of Japan, and the Dutch merchants were only allowed to trade at one port in Dejima. Some hidden Christians did survive in remote areas by disguising themselves as Buddhists. For example, having an icon of the Virgin Mary, but having it look like a Buddhist icon to honor Kannon, the Bodhisattva of compassion. During the Edo period, there were some changes in terms of which Buddhist sect was most prominent. The Edo period shogun, they supported the Soto Zen sect. Previously, during the Kamakura era, Rinzai Zen had been more prominent among the shogun, but that changed during Edo. And they even used the network of Soto Zen temples to help them administer the government. And all families had to register at a Buddhist temple after the year 1640. That was the so-called Donka system. And that old custom is partly why some Japanese families continue to register at Buddhist temples, but also because they may use that temple for funeral services when they die. And this is the case even if the family is not especially religious. In 1615, the government tried to regularize Soto Zen by requiring all of the Soto temples to follow Dogen's writings specifically. Also, during the Edo period, there was the first complete Japanese edition of the Chinese Tripitaka, or Buddhist canon, that was printed in 1681. Another prominent figure in Edo period Buddhism was Menzan Zuiho, who lived from 1683 to 1769. He wrote the authoritative commentaries on Dogen's writings that were used by Soto Zen Buddhists. Later in the Edo period, Soto Zen lost influence, and Neo-Confucianism became more influential among the samurai government. The Confucian scholars were largely critical of Buddhism as not being originally Japanese, and they criticized monks for being lax sometimes, not following their vows, marrying, or eating meat. Originally, Buddhism, by the way, was not vegetarian, but many of the East Asian sects of Buddhism adopted vegetarianism as a practice, but not all the monks would live up to their vows. Fujiwara Seika was a prominent person in the revival or increase of influence of Japanese Neo-Confucianism. He lived from 1561 to 1619. He was originally a Zen monk, but he rejected Buddhism later and advocated Neo-Confucianism in its place. Another prominent figure was Hayashi Razan, who lived from 1583 to 1657. He was a student of Fujiwara Seika, and he regarded Japanese Shinto as an earlier form of Confucianism. Not really true, but you can see some continuities. Confucius emphasized performing rituals, or li, honoring the gods and spirits, as a basis for personal self-development and moral order. And you could see how, from the Japanese perspective, they had their own tradition of rituals honoring the kami, or spirits, as part of Shinto, and that could fit in with the Confucian idea of the importance of religious ceremony. Hayashi Razan created the official Neo-Confucian philosophy that was supported by the later shogun of the Edo period. So there were laws dividing society into four main social classes according to a traditional Confucian scheme. The highest class were the nobles, which were interpreted as the samurai, or warrior clans, in feudal Japan. The class below them was the farmers. Below the farmers were the craftsmen, and merchants, even though some of them were quite wealthy, were the lowest on the Confucian hierarchy, in part because their trade was considered somewhat dishonorable. Each class would have different laws governing how they were supposed to treat or greet others. Basically, all the other classes, for example, had to bow to or show deference to samurai. Only the samurai have the right to bear arms, etc. Yamaga Soko lived from 1622 to 1685. He was a Confucian scholar who codified the Bushido, or way of the warrior, and he was the one who interpreted the samurai, or warrior class of Japan, as the Japanese equivalent of the Confucian junzi, or cultivated gentleman scholar. Yushima Seido was a Confucian temple and academy, or place for scholars to study, built with the help of the lords, or daimyo, and the shogun during the Edo period. In 1790, the shogun issued the Kansei Edict, which made Neo-Confucianism the official philosophy of Japan, replacing Soto Zen as the ideology of the rulers. Now we're going to talk about some Japanese religious practices, both from Shinto and Buddhism. Shinto practices include visiting shrines, including on the New Year's festival and other festivals, or matsuri, throughout the year. There are also Shinto pilgrimages, and people will just pray at shrines when they pass by them. Shrines are often placed alongside roads or trails in the mountains, for example. Another Shinto practice is charms and talismans. Fuda, or ofuda, are stiff paper strips that bear the name and seal of a shrine, and you can usually get one of those in exchange for an offering. There is also feathered wooden arrows, which are popularly believed to ward against evil. You can see the picture on the slide of a kamidana. This is a Shinto altar or shelf. It can have things such as an ofuda, an image of the kami being honored. There's often an object like a mirror or sometimes other objects that are believed to house or be the place where the spirit of the kami dwells. There's also the hempen rope and the shide or paper streamers mentioned previously, and other things such as fruit and flowers or plants can be left as offerings. Shinto weddings are a traditional practice in Japan. They've been popular since a little over 100 years ago when one of the emperors had a very widely publicly documented in the news media Shinto wedding. More recently, Christian and Western or pseudo-Christian style weddings have also become popular in Japan, though partially replacing the traditional Shinto wedding ceremony. And that was apparently first something that started in the 1980s after a widespread television coverage of the wedding between Prince Charles and Diana of England. So some of the Shinto festivals are local. They generally are. The general name for a Shinto festival is Matsuri. An example of a local festival is Gion Matsuri, which is held in July in the city of Kyoto. The purpose of this festival is for purification and protection from disease. A lot of the Matsuri feature processions of floats or just a parade of people walking through the streets. In the Gion Matsuri that happens on July 17th and July 24th. Another feature of Gion Matsuri is people celebrating in the streets and eating a skewered meat specifically. Common elements for Shinto Matsuri, they may recall a historical event. The processions often involve a portable shrine or makoshi, which is taken from the main shrine. These Shinto Matsuri are generally based around one particular shrine or jinja and honoring the main kami that's there. Well, the makoshi or portable shrine will be taken to various points nearby and usually carried by people on a palanquin, as you can see in the picture on the slide. And this symbolizes the kami journeying around the neighborhood, basically around the shrine. There can be various other types of floats and marchers. There may be people dressed up and performing like dramatic scenes on top of some of the floats. They can be decorated with flowers or plants. There's just a lot of variety. There can be people holding standards or banners. There's often a very raucous or celebratory mood. There can be people walking around getting drunk on sake or rice wine, for example. There can be various games or contests. And then usually at the end of the procession, there are offerings given by representatives from the community. They will go with the priests of the shrine to make offerings to the kami there. There are a few different main types of Shinto shrines. You can classify them on the one hand, some are mainly local in their significance. Others, there can be kami that are worshipped around Japan. And then there are a small number of shrines that have a kind of national or semi-political significance. So the local ones are the most common. For example, they might honor the kami of the locality, which are called ujigami. There are other kami that are worshipped across Japan. An example of this type of shrine is the Hachimangu shrines. These honor Hachiman, the god of war. The Inari shrines honor Inari, the god of rice and farming, but also associated with various types of fortune or success in business. There's the Tenmangu shrines, who honor Tenjin, the god of scholars. And the Toshogu shrines honor the shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, the one who founded the Tokugawa Bakufu that ruled during the Edo period. Unified the country. As mentioned, there are some shrines of national or political importance. The Ise Grand Shrines are connected to the emperor and the imperial family. The Izumo Shrines are connected to the founding of Japan, the creation of Japan. The Meiji Shrine honors Emperor Meiji. The end of the Edo period saw the Emperor Meiji restored to become the ruler of Japan, at least officially or ceremonially. In fact, it was a new class that came in and created a new government that was at first kind of quasi-parliamentary, but later became more military as well. And then the most probably controversial Shinto shrine is Yasukuni. This commemorates Japan's war dead, but it honors people accused of war crimes during World War II, among some of the many people who are honored there. And so sometimes this shrine is controversial, especially in other nations that were harmed by acts of war and other war crimes in Japan during the World War II era, such as people in China or Korea. There's also Shinto shrines in mountains. Many mountains in Japan are regarded as sacred and have one or more shrines at their summit. Mountain shrines are often visited by Shinto pilgrims who are seeking purification, and the mountains have long been associated with spiritual powers. A particularly famous example of that is Mount Fuji, a volcanic cone in Japan. You can see a picture of a torii or gate outside of Mount Fuji, but within vision or sighting of the mountain. This is one of those cases where the mountain itself is regarded as a kami, as opposed to some other kami just having a shrine on the mountain, which can also happen. There's also a custom that's very ancient of having Buddhist temples on mountains. For example, Mount Koya has the chief temple of the Shingon sect of Japanese Buddhism. Buddhist practices in the home include having a butsudan or a Buddhist altar. Many families will have this, even if they're not particularly religious. This is the traditional way of honoring the ancestors. So the butsudan will contain usually an image of a Buddha or Bodhisattva, spirit tablets, which are a way of commemorating ancestors in kind of the Confucian tradition. And it can also contain Buddhist scriptures, a place for burning incense to honor the memory of the ancestors and the Buddhas, etc. Another Buddhist practice is a morning ritual of placing a small amount of food on the butsudan, reciting a sutra, and lighting a stick of incense. The details of how this is done vary between different sects of Buddhism. And then a lot of Japanese families will go to a Buddhist temple for the New Year festival, again, even if they're not particularly religious. Another common Buddhist practice involves having Daruma dolls. You can see a picture of one on the slide. These are stylized representations of Daruma. Daruma is the Japanese name of Bodhidharma, who, according to tradition, was an Indian monk who brought the meditation or Chan school of Buddhism to China from India. Historically speaking, some scholars think that even if Bodhidharma was a real Indian monk who came to China, that he didn't really found Chan Buddhism. He may have taught some of the people who they or their students went on to found Chan in China, but the traditional story is the most influential, where he's regarded as transmitting this special teaching of Buddhism that focuses just on wordless meditation, looking at your own mind, seeing into the Buddha nature within, that according to Zen goes all the way back to the Buddha himself. A special wordless teaching outside the scriptures is one of the way that they put it. But Bodhidharma, he was from India, and he's often depicted in Japanese art as being very hairy with a thick beard and as having large eyes. And you can see those features on the Daruma doll stylized depictions of Bodhidharma. Scholars often call the way Buddhism is practiced in Japan funerary Buddhism because a lot of it is kind of more connected to rituals with death and the afterlife. In Japan, funerals are generally Buddhist in character. Buddhist funerals involve cremation, and there will be a spirit tablet with the name of the deceased. That's more like a Confucian custom that's being placed in a Buddhist context. The spirit tablet can also be accompanied by a stone memorial plaque. Visitors to the funeral will place thin wooden posts at the tombstone with texts written in thick black ink. That's another custom as well. So some of the main Buddhist festivals are Higan and Obon. Higan is the name of both the spring and the autumn equinox festivals. And during these times, families often visit cemeteries to honor the remains of their loved ones. There's also Obon, which is a festival in midsummer that is celebrated with bonfires and dancing, but it's also connected to Buddhism and the afterlife. There's a practice of having lanterns or lights that are believed to help guide the lost spirits to the next life. And because Buddhism had this really elaborate set of beliefs about reincarnation and the afterlife and other possible realms in which a person can be reborn, it kind of dominated thinking about death and the afterlife in traditional Japanese religion. You can see the picture on the slide is from a modern Japanese Buddhist funeral. The picture of the deceased and their name has been blurred out for privacy. But what's interesting here is just how elaborate the flower displays are. This contributes greatly to the high cost of Buddhist funerals, and it's one of the main reasons why they're becoming a bit less popular or universal in Japan, even though they're still pretty common. So, some other Buddhist festivals. The Buddha's birthday is celebrated in Japan on April 8th. The traditional Buddhist calendar is lunar, so the dating of traditional Buddhist holidays varies based on the cycle of the moon. But the Japanese government some time ago set particular dates on the modern solar calendar for some of the Buddhist holidays, but there's still some local variation with some of the festivals. So the Buddha's birthday is often celebrated by giving flower offerings to images of the Buddha. You can see a picture of this on the slide. There's often a little miniature altar or frame that's constructed, decorated with flowers. Inside, below the canopy, is placed a small statue of the infant or child Buddha, and that will be anointed with liquid from a bowl beneath. Another Buddhist festival is that of the 47 Ronin, or masterless samurai, called Ako Gishisai Matsuri, which is celebrated on December 14th. The Ronin was a name for samurai or warriors who didn't have a daimyo or lord that they served, perhaps because their lord had previously died and they just had to wander around looking for adventure or for a new cause to fight for or a new lord to serve. The Festival of the 47 Ronin was named after the so-called Akko incident, in which 47 Ronin avenged the death of their former master. This happened on January 31st in the year 1703. They avenged the death 1 year later and then committed seppuku, or ritual suicide. This was something that samurai did traditionally in feudal Japan if they had dishonored themselves or their lord. The reason why these group of Ronin would have committed seppuku is because they would have regarded themselves as having failed at protecting the life of their lord. And so after they avenged his death, they thought that that was the appropriate action to take. In English, seppuku is sometimes called harikiri. I'm not sure the exact origin of that word, but the Japanese name is generally seppuku. So, Chushingura was a traditional drama that's shown at the time of the festival, depicting the events. There's also a procession that reenacts the Ronin's arrival at a particular Soto Zen temple called Sengaku-ji to report their deed of vengeance to the monks there and thus the government. When this happened, it was during the Edo period when the Bakufu, or the government of the shogun, was using the Soto Zen temples as part of their administrative network. And you can see the picture on the slide, a procession of people dressed as the 47 Ronin arriving at Sengaku-ji. Another part of the festival is crowds of people will light incense at their tombs, the tombs of the Ronin. There are also Buddhist pilgrimage routes. So, for example, in the island of Honshu, there are 33 Buddhist sites, mainly in the West, which was the original heartland of Buddhism in Japan, relatively close to the areas of Nara and Kyoto. So this particular Buddhist pilgrimage route in Honshu honors the Bodhisattva Kannon. In the island of Shikoku, there's another pilgrimage route with 88 Buddhist temples, and many tourists will walk this route and visit the various temples along the route. You can see a picture on the slide of Buddhist pilgrims in the island of Shikoku. So now we're going to talk about Japanese religions during the modern period, roughly the last 100 to 150 years. The Meiji period began in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration and lasted until 1912, which was the last year of the rule of Emperor Meiji. The Meiji Restoration is named after the fact that there were some rebels who rebelled against the shogun, or the military ruler of Japan, because they were unhappy with that system of government, and they installed, at least nominally, Emperor Meiji back to the rightful rulership of Japan. Now, the emperors had never really ceased to rule, at least ceremonially, in the capital, and the samurai lords had claimed to rule in the name of the emperors as well. But the Meiji reformers saw themselves as initiating a new era in Japanese politics, and they named it after the emperor. And they made worshiping the emperor as a kami a big part of their kind of like ideology, and in part to bring all Japanese together by worshiping the ceremonial leader of the nation. So these samurai were unhappy with the Tokugawa shogunate, in part because they thought of Japan as stuck in the past. It was living this traditional feudal society that had been baked into the law by the Tokugawa shogun. They weren't adopting Western science or technology. And there was an embarrassing incident earlier in the 1800s when gunboats from the United States basically forced the Japanese to open up to trade with them. And the Western samurai wanted Japan to modernize and westernize and become a military and political power. So they first fought a war against the Tokugawa shogun, the Boshin War, and defeated the Tokugawa. And then they claimed to restore direct imperial rule of Japan. In fact, they established a new system of government with a new constitution modeled on Western parliamentary systems. They ended the old Confucian and feudal social order that had been upheld by the Tokugawa shogunate. They imported Western science and education systems, eventually Western industry, and they built a modern army and navy. So the Meiji Restoration was named after Emperor Meiji, as mentioned, and he lived from 1852 to 1912. During the Meiji Restoration period, the emperor was made the focus of the Shinto religion. So Shinto was kind of transformed into what's called state Shinto, which only really ended after the defeat of Imperial Japan in 1945 at the end of World War II. But they used worshiping the emperor as a kami as a way of uniting people together and creating a patriotic sentiment among the people. There were many changes to Japanese religion after the Meiji Restoration. In 1868, there was a policy of Shinbutsu Bunri that was adopted, which called for the rigid separation of Shinto from Buddhism. So, for example, Shinto shrines had to remove any Buddhist icons and vice versa. Previously, the religions had been somewhat intermingled with each other. The reason for this strict separation is that the new government wanted to use Shinto as a way of unifying all Japanese. And so they tried to make Shinto into something separate from any other religion. They treated Shinto as if it wasn't a religion, but more of a national cultural practice that could be combined with other religions like Buddhism, but they weren't meant to be explicitly tied with Buddhism or any other particular religions. So, in principle, the government would have thought that atheists or Christians or anyone could still honor the kami of the emperor. There also was a persecution of Buddhism by the government set up after the Meiji Restoration from 1868 to 1874. In large part, this was because Buddhism was associated with the old feudal era and the rule of the Tokugawa shogun, who at least earlier had supported Soto Zen, and Buddhism was just kind of really intermingled with the old social order that was being abolished by the new regime. So, as mentioned, they set up a system of state Shinto, according to which all Japanese had a civic duty to worship the emperor as a kami. And they created a new group of state certified Shinto priests and new Shinto rituals as well, involved in this new, more political or patriotic form of Shinto. State Shinto was used in part to increase nationalism and later on even militarism. An example of the latter was Shinto ceremonies that were performed before kamikaze missions during the end of World War II. Those were missions in which Japanese fighter pilots ran suicide missions trying to crash their aircraft into United States naval vessels in order to sink them. The Yasukuni Shrine, as mentioned, honors soldiers who died in service to Japan. It uses Shinto-style rituals, and it's called a shrine or jinja, but it sort of combines them with Buddhist-style ancestor worship. So it's a kind of odd duck in that it's somewhat Shinto, somewhat Buddhist style, and also is overtly political, unlike most other Shinto shrines. There also were some Shin Shugyo, or new sects, new religions that were founded after the Meiji Restoration, including some modern Shinto and Buddhist sects, as well as syncretic religions. The picture on the slide is of Emperor Meiji in the center, who's portrayed as sitting among many different kami and former emperors, so connecting the current emperor of Japan with these other divine beings that would be worshipped as part of Shinto. After 1945, Japan was defeated by the United States largely and unconditionally surrendered to the United States, thus ending World War II in the Pacific Theater. The new constitution that was imposed on Japan by the United States military had a provision that disestablished Shinto from any official connection to the government. So the Shinto shrines, for example, no longer got government financial support and had to find new ways of financing themselves. Since then, many have actually been shut down or ceased to operate just because there is less money available for them, but moreover, the population is becoming less religious, but also a lot of people are just moving away from the country to the cities. And so you see a lot of rural shrines, especially being kind of like gradually abandoned or decommissioned. The emperor is still at the heart of Shinto, however, and performs Shinto rituals. So the emperor is supported by the government. He and the imperial household get an allowance or funding from the state. And so even though technically, according to the Constitution, there's supposed to be a rigid separation between Shinto and the government, in practice, there's at least some overlap because the emperor is financed by the government, but the emperor, part of his role is to perform certain Shinto ceremonies. One of the main things that kept Shinto alive after it was disestablished was the formation of the Jinja Honcho, or Association of Shinto Shrines, in 1946. Shinto shrines are not required to belong to this organization, but the majority are, and it decides things collectively in terms of, for example, how to regulate the education of clergy. One of the things that's been changed, I believe, after the establishment of the Jinja Hansho is that they now allow women to become Shinto priests, although there are still also a separate class of female clergy in Shinto, the shrine maidens, that take part in certain rituals. In order to sustain themselves financially, many Shinto shrines turn to selling the amulets and performing ceremonies for patrons in order to raise funds. A lot of Shinto shrines, they don't have enough money to afford a full-time priest, so some priests will be divided among many shrines. Many priests also just work as priests part-time, and they may have another job in order to support themselves. The emperor is still highly esteemed by the Japanese people. And so there's still this kind of sense, maybe kind of left over from the period after the Meiji Restoration, of the central role of the emperor as kami, or even just as a strong symbol of the Japanese nation. And the Shinto shrines are very important symbols of Japanese culture and nationhood. The picture on the slide is of a shrine to Inari, and what's interesting about this one is it shows how Shinto is still blended with Buddhism. The shrine has statues of Inari, those are the foxes, but also has images of the Buddha. This is at Jogyo-ji in Takatsuki. A bit more about Buddhism after World War II, so from 1945 to present day. There has been a gradual decline in the traditional Buddhist sects, Tendai, Jodoshu, Nichiren, and Zen. Um, there's still a relatively a large percentage of Japanese who identify as Buddhists, but just a small percentage of the population, you could say, is particularly active or devout in the religion. There have been some new Buddhist sects that flourished in the post-war period, such as Soka Gakkai, and Buddhist festivals are still widely celebrated throughout the culture, as are Buddhist funerals. You can see a picture on the slide of a modern celebration of Obon. But especially in the last few decades, there's been a decline of religiosity generally in Japan, since the 1990s at least, if not earlier. So increasing numbers of people just identify as secular or non-religious. This is some data about religious affiliation in modern Japan. There was an NHK Japanese news organization survey from 2012, which showed that 62% of Japanese identify as having no religion. The biggest religion is Buddhism at 31%. After that is Shinto at 3%. About 1% identify as Christian. About 1% identify as members of other religions. Those would include new religions that aren't classified as Shinto, Buddhist, or Christian. So you'll notice Shinto looks like it has a very small degree of adherence on that survey, 3%, but that's really only capturing people who belong to particular Shinto sects or organized forms of Shinto, whereas most people who practice Shinto in Japan do so informally, like in festivals or visiting shrines as needed. It's more combined in the culture and daily life. You can see that type of Shinto, what could be called a shrine Shinto or folk Shinto, reflected in the stats from the CIA fact book for Japan, which claims 70.5% of Japanese people are Shintoists and 67.2% practice Buddhism. How is there such a large gap in these numbers? So the CIA fact book is using different criteria. Not people who are members of a Shinto sect or registered at a Buddhist temple, but just those who regularly or semi-regularly participate in the religion in any way, such as going to a festival or lighting incense to the Buddha and their family altar, things like that. Shin Shugyo is the Japanese name for new religions. There's a general sort of custom or tradition in Japan, connected especially to Shinto, of people getting visions or revelations or messages, including from a spirit medium, from a kami or deity. And these can lead to new shrines being built in Shinto They can also lead to the formation of new sects, including specific organized forms of Shinto, often founded by someone who claims to have had a vision or revelation of a particular kami. Sometimes the kami will reveal to them new scriptures as well. But there can be other non-Shinto versions of Shin Shugyo or new religions as well. An example is Tenrikyo, which means the religion of the heavenly wisdom. This was founded by Nakayama Miki, who lived from 1798 to 1887, and who had various revelations and healings. So this was a monotheistic form of religion, worshiping a god called by various names, including Tenri O no Mikoto. And this sect also has its own scriptures and rituals. And their main temple is in a city called Tenri, that's named after the religion itself, which means heavenly wisdom. Another Shin Shugyo is Tensho Kotai Jingukyo, or Odoru Shugyo, which means the dancing religion. It was founded by Kitamura Sayo, who lived from 1900 to 1967, and she believed that a kami was speaking to her through her abdomen. So she taught a religion that uses ecstatic dancing. You can see a picture of some people doing that on the slide. That enables believers to experience a state of muga, or not self. The concept of not self comes from Buddhism, where it has different interpretations, but one meaning is letting go of the sense of self or ego to experience a higher consciousness or a higher reality. So you can see that Buddhist idea being used in the Odoru Shugyo, but they have their own non-Buddhist teachings as well. And the ecstatic dancing is not practiced by Buddhists, so that's very specific to that sect. Other new movements also emerged in the 20th century in Buddhism. One of them is Risho Koseikai, which was a Buddhist movement led by lay people as opposed to monks and was founded in 1938. They had branched off from Rei Gai, and they focus on the Lotus Sutra and also ancestor worship. So that's kind of like a common theme in some various Buddhist organizations or movements that started in Asia in the 20th century. Many of them featured a larger role for lay people. There are various sects of Chinese Buddhism that are like that as well, for example. Another new Buddhist movement started in Japan is Soka Gakkai. This is another organization led by lay people. This one was founded in 1930. They're distinctive because they take the Buddhist teaching of nonviolence very seriously, even to the point of advocating pacifism as a political doctrine. This got them in trouble during the era of the Second World War. The leaders were imprisoned by the military government, but eventually the sect grew to prominence, especially after the end of World War II. So unlike other sects of Japanese Buddhism, Soka Gakkai is highly missionary. They seek out not only many Japanese converts, but foreigners as well. So they're one of the more well-known sects of Japanese Buddhism outside of Japan. There's also Nichiren Shoshu, which is an order of monks, Buddhist monks that are allied with Soka Gakkai. And the reason why they have this sort of affiliate monastic order is because Soka Gakkai is itself still managed by lay people. And they even have a political wing called the Komeito, which means the Clean Government Party. So Japan, like a lot of other developed nations, has largely secularized. There are still significant numbers of people who practice Buddhism or Shinto in one form or another. It's fair to say as well that Confucianism retains a significant influence on the culture. You can even see elements of that in values such as loyalty, shame, correct behavior, etc. Although many of those may have predated the introduction of Chinese Confucianism specifically to Japan, Confucianism definitely goes along with those values, and it was supported as an ideology by the Tokugawa shogunate for over a century, so it really got baked in deeply into the Japanese culture. You can also see many Japanese interact with Shinto and Buddhism through festivals, shrines, funerals, weddings, and other aspects of the culture. And pop culture contains many references to the traditional religions, such as films, anime, manga, video games, etc. That's it for our summary and overview of Korean and Japanese religions. Next up, we're going to look at Judaism. Until next time.